Press that to turn on.
And
Okay,
it
fantastic.
picks up a lot. So. He has a minute to get here, so we have both of our opening statements. Good morning. Quorum being present, the Education and Labor Committee will come to order. And I'd like to welcome everyone here for this legislative hearing on underpaid teachers in crumbling schools, how the underfunding public education shortchanges America's students. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, opening statements are limited to the chair and ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides members an adequate time to ask questions. And I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. This morning, we're here to discuss how chronically underfunding public education is affecting students, parents, teachers, and communities. This is a discussion our constituents are eager for us to have and a challenge for American people who are calling us to solve. In Oklahoma, West Virginia, Arizona, Los Angeles, and many other cities and states in between, voters are demanding greater support for public education. In a time of extreme polarization, support for public education is a rare bridge across our political and cultural divisions. A poll conducted after the 2018 midterm elections, in that poll, an overwhelming majority of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, said increasing K-12 funding is a, quote, extremely important priority for the 116th Congress. The widespread support for public education makes our longstanding unfortunate tradition of failing to prioritize public education both confounding and frustrating. You can look no further than Title 1A of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the largest grant program in K-12. Title 1A supports public schools with large numbers of students living in poverty. In the 2017-2018 school year, Congress gave schools less than a third of the full authorization amount for this basic grant program. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, known as IDEA, is another example. IDEA protects students with disabilities and making sure they can receive a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. To help achieve this goal, it authorizes grants to offset extra costs associated with supporting students with disabilities. IDEA has not been fully funded at any point in its 44-year history. In fact, funding levels for IDEA have never reached even half of the authorized levels. And despite the evidence linking well-resourced facilities, well-supported teachers, and healthy buildings to better economic and life outcomes, the federal government dedicates no money to public school infrastructure improvements. The lack of federal support has exacerbated the issues caused by a lack of commitment to robust public education funding at the state level. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, adjusted for inflation, 29 states spent less per student in 2015 than they had in 2008 before the Great Recession. In 17 of those states, funding per pupil was cut at least 10%. Today, despite the long and growing list of school building failures that have endangered students and educators, 12 states contribute no money to support school facilities, and an additional 13 states cover between 1% and 9% of school facility costs. The combination of chronic federal and state underfunding in public education has left many schools at a literal breaking point. According to one study published in 2016, public K-12 facilities are on average underfunded about $46 billion every year compared to building industry and best practice standards. In 2014, the Department of Education estimated that it would cost $197 billion to bring all schools into good condition. This problem is not limited to physical infrastructure. As technology becomes increasingly central to providing quality education, the lack of funding for basic school upgrades has forced schools to put off needed investments in digital infrastructure. In a 2017 Education Superhighway report, that report found that more than 19,000 schools serving nearly a quarter of public school students are without the minimum connectivity necessary for digital learning. Now, our nation primarily funds public education using property taxes. So the erosion of federal and state support has had a particularly harmful effect in low-income districts where revenue is lacking and where schools are therefore chronically underfunded. And this underfunding has consequences. For example, in September 2018, dozens of New Jersey schools closed for weeks because of mold. Baltimore closed schools the same month during a heat wave because many schools did not have air conditioning. And notably, in Baltimore, only 3% of the schools are less than 35 years old. 5 years after the discovery of lead contamination in the water, schools in Flint, Michigan, finally have a water filtration system, incredibly only because of a private donation. So 2 weeks ago, I joined Congressman Norcross and Senator Jack Reed, along with 180 members of Congress, to introduce the Rebuild America School Act. This bill would create a $70 billion grant program and a $30 billion tax credit bond program targeted at improving the physical and digital infrastructure at high-poverty schools. In doing so, it would create roughly 1.9 million good-paying jobs. In fact, the Rebuild America Schools Act would actually create more jobs than the recent $1.9 trillion Republican tax bill at approximately 5% of the cost. At the start of its presidency, and again in the State of the Union last week, President Trump called on a massive infrastructure package to rebuild America. School infrastructure must be part of that package when we consider it. And this should be a bipartisan effort. An overwhelming majority of Americans understand the correlation between consistent nationwide failure to support public schools and inequality in educational opportunity. We can do better. The total U.S. spending on education accounts for 2% of the federal budget. That's less than most other developed nations. Now, it'll take a long-term commitment to public schools in order to see the consistent results we expect. We must be willing to make that commitment, and I want to close by recognizing the burden we continue to place on America's educators. While crumbling schools are a visible risk to students, the effect of chronic underfunding on our teachers is equally, if not more, concerning. Accounting for inflation, teacher pay actually fell $30 a week from 1996 to 2015. Public school teachers already earn just 77% of what other college graduates with similar work experience earn in weekly wages. Teachers who live at the intersection of declining salaries and undersourced schools continue to demonstrate their dedication to their students. And making matters worse, as an example of that, they spend an average of $485 of their own money every year to buy classroom materials and supplies. If we cannot attract and retain the most talented, passionate teachers in the classroom, we will fail to fulfill our promise to students of their quality education. And so without objection, I'd like to enter into the record the following documents. First, a list of organizations that endorse Rebuild America Schools Act and their endorsing statements, and the following reports. One by the National Conference of State Legislatures, No Time to Lose, How to Build a World-Class Education System State by State, by the Learning Policy Institute, How Money Matters for Schools, by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, A Punishing Decade for School Funding, by the Center for American Progress, A Case for Federal Funding for School Infrastructure, one by the 21st Century School, U.S. Green Building Council and the National Council on School Facilities, The State of Our Schools, America's K-12 Facilities, and finally, Fixing Chronic Disinvestment in K-12 Schools, the Center for American Progress. I ask all those documents be placed in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I look forward to the discussion, and now I recognize our distinguished ranking member, Dr. Fox, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Teachers work hard on behalf of American students and families, and they deserve paychecks that reflect their tireless efforts. And all students deserve access to safe, clean, and healthy school facilities, regardless of zip code. To dispute these two facts would make anyone out of touch with reality. Over the past year, there's been a steady stream of well-publicized strikes across the country. Teachers' unions in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, Los Angeles, and most recently Denver all called attention to these matters. So given the recent uptick in teachers' union strikes, a reasonable person would assume that state and local governments are cutting budgets and disinvesting in public schools. Quite the contrary. In fact, most states have actually increased public school spending, but instead of increasing salaries, improving structures, and investing in classroom equipment, many school districts have ended up pouring taxpayer funds into administrative bloat that leaves students and teachers high and dry. It's been said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. When it comes to these two issues, teacher pay and school construction, Democrats have not had a new idea in decades. Anytime a challenge arises, Democrats look to refill the same prescription of more money, more bureaucracy, and more power punted to distant figures in Washington. Is the answer more control from Washington? Well, having just emerged from a government shutdown, I think most Americans would agree that the less politicians can control and leverage, the better. Teachers and students deserve more than the same tired fights over money. We need to find new and innovative approaches to public school success. Republicans still and will always believe that the best solutions for serving children emerge from the communities in which they live and grow. I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to serve my community as a member of the local school board. So I know firsthand how complicated it can be trying to make resources, regardless of whether they're local or federal resources, coming from taxpayers, actually serve students in a way they can recognize. That's why we need to engage thoughtfully and hopefully in new initiatives to make education a central focus in community development. Community development can come in all shapes and sizes, and one of the most interesting new concepts to emerge has been opportunity zones. Opportunity zones are areas of the country that look very much like the community in which I was raised and which I proudly represent today. These are communities where the poverty rate exceeds 30%, and local industry has struggled to rebound from the 2008 recession. Opportunity zones, which are home to over 50 million Americans, will spur private industry to make long-term investments in these communities. This bipartisan community development initiative was initially championed by Senators Tim Scott and Cory Booker, and in 2017 was signed into law by President Trump as a provision of the Republican Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The provisions in this law have the potential to unleash trillions of dollars in private capital for long-term investment in impoverished parts of the country. Time will tell if opportunity zones and other new initiatives will finally help us solve the problems of low teacher pay and poor school facilities. But time has already told us that higher price tags and more bureaucracy in Washington don't deliver higher results. Today, we're going to be listening for fresh ideas and signs of innovation as we pursue our shared goals of better environments for students and teachers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Fox, and I wanted to thank you for your comments. I was especially delighted to hear your compliment that we have been consistent in our refrain that we need more federal funding for education, and we haven't backed off on that. And I want to thank you for that compliment. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements can do so by notifying the committee clerk within 7 days. In introducing the witnesses, I note that The first witness is from North Carolina, and 2 members have insisted on the privilege of introducing her, so I'll first yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Sharon Contreras to our committee today. Dr. Contreras is the superintendent for the Guilford County Schools in my district in North Carolina. We have enjoyed working together on several occasions since she first joined the Guilford County School District in 2016. She has an extensive career in education since she first began her career as a high school teacher, English teacher, in Rockford, Illinois. Dr. Contreras has a real heart to serve the students of Guilford County. She is a woman of faith, if I might add. We don't always agree with the exact approach, but most importantly, she's my friend. Dr. Contreras has accomplished all of this while being hearing impaired. So as we talk to her today or ask questions, just make sure that she has eye contact, and she will deliver in a very accomplished manner today. I would now like to yield to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, to say a few words about Dr. Contreras.
Thank you. I thank my friend for yielding. As some of you may know, before a change in the district lines in our state, for 31 years I represented parts of Guilford County and Greensboro, and began my service in public office as the first African-American woman elected to the school board. So I do have some sense of the Guilford County schools. Dr. Contreras is the first woman and the first Latina superintendent of Guilford County schools. Guilford County has 126 schools and serve more than 71,000 students, 40% Black, 30% white, 16% Latina, 6% Asian. 7% of Guilford County school students have disabilities, and 64% of its students are low income. But under Dr. Contreras' leadership, the high school graduation rate has reached 89.8%, the highest in Guilford County history. I just want to mention as a personal note that Dr. Contreras is a woman of vision. She spearheaded the first Assistant Principals Leadership Academy through the New Leaders Program, and my daughter is a member of that academy, and I want to thank her for not only her leadership. Dr. Contreras, welcome to the committee, and I thank the gentleman for North Carolina for allowing me a brief comment in this introduction, and I yield back to him.
I thank the lady for yielding and refraining from too much shade, and with that, I yield back to the chairman. So,
Thank you. Our next witness is also represented by a person with us today. I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from Oklahoma, who is not a member of the committee, but without objection will be recognized for purpose of an introduction.
Thank you so much, Chairman Scott, for the opportunity to address the committee and the privilege of introducing Anna King. I am honored to introduce a proud Oklahoman with a strong history of advocating for public education. Anna has dedicated over 20 years of her life to not only improving educational quality for her children and grandchildren through local PTAs, but also to advocating for every single child across the country through her current role as the Vice President of Membership of the National Parent-Teacher Association, which has over 3.5 million members nationwide. I've had the privilege, as she resides in my district, of watching and working with Anna and seeing her passionate support for public schools and students. Anna firmly believes that education is the cornerstone of opportunity in this country. The best investment that we can make in America's future is an investment in the minds of our youth. And as our nation grows and diversifies, our schools must have the tools and resources to keep pace, something which I know Ms. King will speak about. Across this country, including my home state, teachers are far too often forced to work second and multiple jobs because their salary simply isn't enough to pay the bills. And parents and advocates like Anna are speaking up because their kids deserve better. In 2018, we have some experience with this, as you mentioned, Chairman Scott. Oklahoma saw more than 50,000 individuals, educators, parents, and community members walk out in support of our public school teachers, our students, and our communities. Simply put, quality public education is a cornerstone of our communities and a strong economy. And if we want communities to thrive, we can no longer ignore the challenges our schools face. So thank you, Anna, for your passion, your advocacy, and for wanting the best for all kids, regardless of their zip code, the thousands of future leaders in Oklahoma's 5th Congressional District and children across the nation will benefit from your advocacy. Thank you again, Chairman, for allowing me to speak, and thank you to the members of the committee, and I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much. Next witness is Dr. Benjamin Scafidi, who is a professor of economics and director of educational economics, director of the Education Economics Center at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia and his BA from Notre Dame. His research is focused on urban policy and education, and he was previously an education policy advisor to Governor Sonny Perdue of Georgia. Randy Weingartner is president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO, as president. She has overseen the development of AFT's quality education agenda, which advocates for reforms grounded in evidence, equity, scalability, and sustainability. She has used her platform to advocate for more state and federal investment in public education, as noted by AFT's recent report, A Decade of Neglect, Public Education Funding in the Aftermath of the Great Recession. She holds degrees from Cornell's University School of Industrial and Labor Relations and the Cardozo School of Law. We appreciate all the witnesses for being with us today and look forward to your testimony. I remind you that we have your full statements are available and will appear in full in the record pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice. Each of you is asked to limit your presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. We remind the witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 U.S. Code Section 101, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact to Congress or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it will turn on and members can hear you. As you speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, it will turn to yellow, indicating 1 minute remaining, and when the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired, and we'd ask you to please wrap up your testimony. We will let the entire panel make presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember again to turn your microphone on. We'll first recognize Dr. Contreras.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Fox, Congressman Walker, Congresswoman Adams, and members of the committee. I am Sharon Contreras, Superintendent of Guilford County Schools in Greensboro, North Carolina. With me today are my colleagues Angie Henry, the Chief Financial Officer, and Julius Monk, the Executive Director of Facilities. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. As an educator and administrator of nearly 30 years who has worked in public schools in several states, I have seen firsthand how good facilities can create healthy, safe, and innovative spaces that truly support 21st century learning. I have also seen firsthand how inadequate facilities, broken HVAC systems, and dilapidated buildings negatively affect learning. The substantial obstacles we face in bringing America's schools up to par date back generations and are found in every state, particularly in our urban and rural areas, which serve the highest concentrations of children and adults living in poverty. Guilford County Schools serves more than 73,000 pre-K-12 students in 126 schools in a county-wide district that spans about 650 square miles and encompasses urban, suburban, and rural areas. Our students come to our doorsteps eager to learn. Unfortunately, our doors don't always open to facilities designed to meet the needs of students in the post-industrial era. Our average school building is about 50 years old and was designed for an industrial era that no longer exists. We have 469 mobile classrooms, 58% of which are more than 20 years old. We have 5 mobile units that date to 1972. We had to move one last year. It was so old it broke apart while we were transporting it, blocking traffic for hours. Our maintenance staff respond to more than 30,000 work orders annually for failing HVAC units, plumbing systems, leaky roofs, and other basic building needs. Schools routinely use buckets and trash cans to catch the water during heavy rains. Water seepage and flooding is also common, especially since our county has, during just the past year, experienced a devastating tornado, 2 hurricanes, an unusual 12-inch snowfall, and a record 64 inches of rain. A recent comprehensive facility study indicated we need more than $1.5 billion in capital investment to renovate and upgrade current facilities and build new schools. According to the study, more than 45% of our schools were rated as unsatisfactory or in poor condition. Many of the schools rated as unsatisfactory or poor are also Title I schools, educating the poorest and most vulnerable students. 10 schools were in such bad shape that they were recommended for possible closure. The deferred maintenance backlog in our district was pegged at $800 million, while renewal funding for preventative maintenance and reasonable replacement cycles was estimated at $6.9 billion over a 30-year period. Our current maintenance budget, however, is only around $6 million a year. While the physical condition of our buildings is troubling, our greatest concern is that most of our schools do not meet the baseline standards required to adequately support 21st century learning, with the average school rated as poor in terms of educational suitability on the same recent facility study. I could give many more examples from school districts in North Carolina, and some are outlined in my written testimony. Our crumbling school infrastructure requires national leadership and federal funding to assist state and local efforts to upgrade our schools for our students. I support Chairman Scott's introduction of the Rebuild America Schools Act of 2019 and encourage this committee and Congress to come together and prioritize investments in our school buildings and our students. Transforming learning and life outcomes for children and young people is not a partisan issue. It is the issue our nation must address if we want future generations to prosper, if we want our children and grandchildren to live fulfilling lives, and if we intend to preserve our great democracy. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the infrastructure needs of our nation's public schools. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Ms. King.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on this panel to share the perspectives of parents and families on the lack of investments and resources our nation's students, teachers, and schools. I'm speaking on behalf of the National PTA, the nation's oldest and largest child advocacy association with members in all 50 states, D.C., Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Europe. Since 1897, National PTA has been a strong advocate for all families to effectively change their child's education. Long-term success of our nation depends on robust and equitable public investments in our education system. Public education is a major vehicle for preserving the basic values of a democratic system of government. It must be strengthened and continue to be governed by public officials accountable to the public and funded fairly. National PTA has long advocated to ensure all children have access to equitably funded public schools that improve overall well-being and help them achieve their academic success. While I come to you today as a Vice President of Membership of the National PTA, the most important role I have is a mother and a nana. I'm a proud mother of 3 and a grandmother of 9. Like me, every parent wants to be successful, and as an association, we want all kids to be successful, not just one school or one group of kids. I'm here today to speak for every child with one voice on the need to adequately fund our nation's public schools. In 2002, my daughter Annalicia was a freshman at Frederick A. Douglass High School in Oklahoma City. She could not complete her homework because her and all her 9th grade classmates did not have regular access to textbooks for her English class. There were some old books available, but they were old. Pages were missing, and students had to share them during class. No one could take them home to do homework. I had to speak up not only for Annalicia, but for every child in my daughter's class. We were told that the school district, didn't have the money for additional textbooks. So we, as parents, testified at the next school board meeting and showed up at every one to push until we got the funding. Finally, the school district provided funding to purchase textbooks and put parents on decision-making committees. However, 17 years later, the same equity challenges remain. Our teachers in Oklahoma walked out of the classrooms in 2018 for the same reasons I started advocating in 2002, underfunding and a lack of resources. We can't continue to repeat this vicious cycle. Bottom line, Oklahoma does not invest enough in our schools. My state ranks 47th per pupil spending, funding has been steadily cut, and teachers are underpaid. Also, Oklahoma is one of the 12 states, that does not provide any funding to school districts to build, improve, or renovate schools. As a grandparent now, I see my children are fighting the same fight and facing the same challenges in education that I went through years ago. PTA appreciates Congress' recent investments in increasing funding. However, student educators' still needs are not met. Congress must raise discretionary spending caps. Without an increase, these caps, education, health, and workforce funding will face close to $20 billion cut. This means 10% less funding for students with disabilities, 10% less spent on low-income students, and less spending to support teacher professional development. Congress needs to better fund critical programs in every Student Succeeds Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. In particular, Congress must ensure Title I and the state grants for special education services are fully funded. Additionally, more resources need to be provided for educator professional development, English learners, safe and supportive schools, technology, and access to the well-rounded education with robust student support services. Congress should also increase its investments in family engagement through the statewide engagement family centers. This initiative is assisting parent centers in 13 states around the country to ensure families can engage in their child's school to support their education. We urge Congress to increase funding to at least $15 million in the fiscal year 2020 and put this program on funding path to ensure all states can benefit in the coming years. Building a reflection and priorities. In Oklahoma and across the nation, our priority should be investment in all children. All schools should be equally resourced, and Congress must do its part to make sure that every child's potential becomes a reality. If you are not already a member of PTA, I welcome all of you here today to become members of the nation's oldest and the largest child advocacy association, PTA. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to testify on behalf of our nation's children and families for increased investments in public education, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Scafafi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Scott and distinguished representatives, since 1992, according to publicly available data at the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, at the U.S. Department of Education, real inflation-adjusted spending per student in American public schools increased by 37%. First slide, please. Oh, thank you. There it is. That is, public school students in 2016 had 37% more in real resources devoted to their schooling relative to students in 1992. So where did these increased resources go? Over this period, there was a 20% increase in the number of public school students and a 30% increase in the number of public school teachers. This fact is commonly known as class size reductions were implemented throughout the nation. We reduced class sizes. So where did the rest of the money go? Second slide, please. First, using publicly available data from NCES, one can sort public school employees into two categories, teachers and everybody else. I call this second category all other staff, and it literally includes all public school employees who are not teachers. This category of all other staff increased by 52% over this time period. When compared to the 20% increase in students, this category of all other staff increased by more than 2.5 times as the increase in students. I do not believe this fact is widely known. As you know, some dislike economists, Perhaps we are too nerdy. Perhaps we do not brush our teeth regularly. Perhaps there are many other good reasons for these negative feelings. But another reason why some dislike economists is because we point out that in real life, when we make choices, there are uncomfortable opportunity costs. You might expect that if public schools are given a 37% increase in real resources, that teachers would get a real increase in their salaries. But you'd be mistaken. Real teacher salaries actually declined by just under 1 percentage point. That means on average, a teacher in 1992 had a slightly higher real salary than a teacher in 2016. Why? One reason for this stagnation in teacher salaries was the tremendous increase in all other staff. For the sake of illustration, let's keep the class size reductions. However, suppose that the increase in all other staff had only been 20% to match the increase in students. If all other staff had increased 20% to match the increase in students, then a cautious estimate of the savings to the public education system is $40.8 billion per year in annual recurring savings. This tremendous increase in all other staff presented a significant opportunity cost. What could we have done instead with $40.8 billion per year? One thing would be to give all American public school teachers a $12,900 per year increase in compensation. Another possibility would have been to give over 5 million children scholarships to attend the private schools of their choice. Next slide, please. In a sharp break with American public school history, as of 2016, the majority of public schools employees in the United States were not teachers. This staffing surge in public schools began long before 1992. Next slide, please. In fact, this staffing surge has been going on since at least 1950. Since 1950, the number of public school students in America has roughly doubled. The number of teachers has increased almost 2.5 times that amount. But the increase in all other staff has been 7 times the increase in students. These trends could be forgiven if outcomes have improved tremendously or if American public schools were the envy of the world. According to long-term trend scores on the NAEP, National Assessment for Educational Progress, scores for 17-year-olds have been stagnant since 1992. Next slide, please. If taxpayers continue to provide significant increases in resources to the conventional public education system, literally decades of history has taught us there will be significant increases in employment of all other staff, stagnant teacher salaries, and stagnant outcomes for American students. Mr. Chairman and distinguished representatives, there is a better way. We now have a large research base that indicates that increasing opportunities for American families to exercise choice to both charter and private schools would improve long-run outcomes for American students. First, virtually all the evidence shows that students who are allowed to exercise choice have significant gains in post-secondary attainment and in wages. NAEP scores have gone up dramatically in Arizona and Florida, the 2 states with the most choice. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you. Ms. Weingarten.
Good morning, Chairman Scott, Dr. Fox, and as this high school social study and government teacher on leave from Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn, New York, I am very grateful for the opportunity to testify in our democracy and to testify about how deep and chronic underfunding of public education has led to a lack of investment in school infrastructure and public services, which in turn has shortchanged the 90% of America's school children that attend public schools. AFT members and our students live with the effects of this every single day. For example, I just returned from visiting schools in the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, where teachers are spending 10 cents per page in their local staples to adding up to hundreds of dollars a week of their own money to ensure that kids have learning materials before them. And there are still mold-infested schools, mold that any asthmatic, including myself, could detect in a brief time there. You're seeing some of the pictures that we've just taken over the course of the last couple of years about the building conditions. Speaking of mold, last year, 2 Philadelphia elementary schools were closed because of mold throughout the buildings. Of course, many schools that have mold are not closed because we need them to educate our kids. And a recent survey of Detroit schools found that nearly a third of the school buildings are in unsatisfactory or poor conditions, with exposed electrical wires, leaky roofs, and rodent infections. And as the chair said, we have been at this for 25 years. I filed a suit in New York City 25 years ago about these issues. Baltimore, last winter, teachers called on the city to close schools because of chronic heating problems as indoor temperatures plunged into the 30s and children tried to learn bundled in coats and hats. And speaking about Florida, in Hillsborough County, the district could afford to fix or replace air conditioners at 10 schools this summer, leaving 38 still in major repairs. And so when schools opened or reopened in August, indoor temperatures were at 88 degrees. Lastly, teachers across the country tell me all the time about having to clean up mouse droppings in the morning and brand new whiteboards rendered unusable because of no access to electricity. Frankly, we can do better, and that is why teachers in Oklahoma, Arizona, and other places actually went on walkouts this year to say we can do better. Teachers are helping. We're digging into our own pockets. Literally, as the chair said, almost $500 of their own money every year to buy school supplies, but in Title I schools, that number goes up to almost $600. The chair talked about the systematic way that we have looked at this. And Dr. Fox, listen, we actually looked at these things. And in 25 states, we're spending less on public education than we did before the recession. And in 41 states, we're spending less on higher education. We did this district by district, state by state. Ultimately, we are trying to help. We will do whatever we can regardless of the conditions in schools, but we need help from others too. And the communities are engaged in self-help too. During the 2018 election, Wisconsin taxpayers passed referendums to direct at least $1.3 billion to school districts for capital projects while maintaining or expanding programming. In Florida, every local ballot initiative for school funding passed, 20 out of 20. And there are similar stories throughout the country, but we know that property taxation only exacerbates inequality. The AFT is helping too. We are doing what we can in terms of funding community schools, in terms of engaging in this help, and in terms of fighting to fund our future. But we need Congress to help too. And that is why we completely endorse Chairman Scott's proposal to pass the Rebuild America School Act, because that will direct funding for capital projects. We also think we have to fund Title I so that every Title I student has access to physical and mental health services, such as the full-time teacher assistants and the librarians and the guidance counselors that they need and that this anniversary of Parkland are showing that we need. We need to fund the IDEA. The government promised 40% of funding, yet the contribution never exceeded 16%. Look, I'm passionate about this. I live these schools. I work these schools. My kids have done really well in these schools, but it's a defining moment to work together on real, sustainable solutions to this disinvestment. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now have questions from members, beginning with gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Weingarten, and the questions, I'm going to present you with a question somewhat jumbled because I haven't, and I know you'll be able to provide a response once you know, part of the reason we're at this point in terms of school funding, facilities, teacher pay, et cetera, is I think part of the reason is the movement during this period of time intensifying of privatizing public education and the incentivizing with taxpayer dollars that growth. This policy shift's affected many things: classroom teachers, basic facility renovations and upgrades, new construction. Can you talk about that correlation?
Yes, I can, Congressman. So, look, I brought a op-ed that was dated 2/12/2019, which we will put in the record, from Dennis Smith in the West Virginia Gazette, entitled Words of Caution from Experience in Failed Charter Systems. This was a charter school administrator and authorizer that ended up talking about what happened in Ohio. We all know what happened in LA, where charters take the first dollar, $600 million, out of the public school systems, and it siphons off that money in that way. And let me just say, before I read his quote here, that I actually run one of the highest performing charter schools in the United States. It's called UniPrep. It's in New York City. It's a public charter school. It's a unionized school. We have between a 95 and 100% graduation rate for the last 6 years. And what we have done is actually put one guidance counselor for every 100 kids. But what Mr. Smith says is, take Ohio, where charters have operated for 20 years. From a high point of 400 schools, 340 are operating today. Moreover, there is a junk pile, this are his words, not mine, of failed charters that have closed. The Ohio Department of Education website lists 290 schools that are shuttered, with some closing mid-year, disrupting the lives of students and their family. Moreover, total charter school enrollment in the state is down by 16,000.
Thank you.
My point is just this. Charters have to operate within a public school system. They have to be accountable. They have to be transparent, and they cannot siphon off money that other children need.
Thank you. If I may, Ms. King, a question along that same topic. Having been a school board member way back when, back home in Tucson Unified School District, one of the issues with charters, whether they be public or private for-profit as well, is the issue of accountability and oversight, that public school systems are required by law, and justifiably so, to produce financial records, disclosure, conflict of interest, keep your minutes. Board members are bound by the open meetings law. Charters don't have that. Do you think it's important that if we are going to have this public charter or private for-profit, that they too have some level of accountability for their finances, their work, and that be public and that be noted?
Absolutely. Yeah. When we are talking about public education and the funding that goes into our schools, that's important. We have accountability for a reason. And listening to our guests today speak passionately about public education and even why public education is needed. Our charter schools, and whether they're public or for charter or, you know, okay, so I'm nervous. And I'm very passionate about kids. So if I feel like I'm getting ready to cry, I have to calm myself down. Because our students right now need resources. Our schools, our teachers need to be paid, right? And it's not fair when we're taking public dollars and putting them in for-profit charter schools, and there's no accountability on anything that they're doing to run their schools, but we are held at a higher level of accountability for public schools. It's not fair for the students in our communities and in our schools and for the families that they serve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank you. Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses here today. I'll make one brief personal comment. Dr. Contreras, I wanted to be a high school English teacher, but I was too poor to do student teaching, so I wound up, look at this, with a wasted life here. Instead of I could have become a teacher and a superintendent. Look at that. Thank you very much for what you do. Dr. Scafidi, I've argued publicly several times before that teachers should be paid more. I appreciate that your testimony backs up my impression, which is that teacher salaries have not kept pace with the cost of living. I can understand why teachers are upset. Unfortunately, your research shows that all the activism from teachers is generating public education spending, which is largely directed away from instruction. If you were advising teachers how they should approach negotiations with state and local leaders, what would you suggest they advocate for to ensure that new resources benefit them?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fox. There are powerful forces in the public education system driving this increase in all other staff. And so if teachers, their priorities should be what their priorities are, but if their priority is salaries, they should focus on that issue, because my kids are in public school in Georgia, and I wrote a paper about what I called the 13-layer cake. There are 13 layers of public officials that have a say in what goes on in my children's classroom. Congress, the President, Secretary of Education, U.S. Department of Education, Governor, State House. We have a bunch of state education agencies, school board. All of them have policy priorities, and all those policy priorities might be great, but what it's led to over many decades is an increase in all other staff. If teachers want salary increases, they should focus like a laser beam on that.
Thank you, Dr. Scafferty. You've pointed out that since 1992, public education has received a 37% increase in real resources. And you've pointed out that student performance hasn't significantly changed over that time. And yet we're constantly told that if we just spend a little more, we'll unlock the secret to vast improvements in performance. Do you think you could highlight for me the level of magical spending we need to see an increase in performance?
You can always grab a study that says if we increase spending by X, we'll get an achievement increase of Y, right? And some of those studies are well done by great researchers with great data, great methods, great research designs, what have you. But then when you look at the spending increases that they say will lead to this increase in achievement, then in the real world, we typically increase spending by even more than that, and the achievement gains don't materialize. So it's perhaps ironic that the economist is saying we need to look at the real world. If in the real world, spending increases aren't translating into achievement gains, then we've got to question that research. There is no magic number
Thank you.
in the current system.
Thanks. One more question. This may offend you, but as I was saying before, I've argued publicly several times that teachers should be paid more. What I've actually said is that elementary and secondary education teachers should be paid more and college professors should be paid less. Because the teachers at the elementary and secondary have the tougher job. I believe K-12 teachers have a harder job, but I also know that post-secondary salaries are much more market-driven. Are there steps that state and local policymakers could take that would make teachers' salaries more market responsive?
Sure. There's a professor retired at Stanford University, Mike Kirst. You should look him up. He shares your views about salaries. Yes, in higher ed, our salaries are largely market-driven. Disciplines like business, law, medicine, engineering that have good outside options, even economics, we're paid quite well. Disciplines like the humanities that have less good outside options, actually, they probably would, financially would have been better off being a K-12 teacher instead of spending all that time and money getting a PhD. So for humanities professors, it's rough. So how could we make teacher salaries more market-driven? All the rage in policy debates is about monopsonistic labor markets, one buyer of labor. The most monopsonistic labor market in the United States is the public education system, because in a community or even a county, you have one buyer of labor that's the big player. And when there's one buyer of labor in any walk of life, the workers can be exploited. We need to have a more market-driven education system, and then teachers will get paid more and they'll be treated a lot better.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield my time to my colleague from Connecticut, Congresswoman Hayes, the 2016 National Teacher of the Year.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. First of all, Ms. King, please don't ever apologize for being passionate about children. And my apologies to Randy Weingarten. I could have given you a proper introduction had I known. But we are here today to discuss a topic that hits home for me. As you heard my colleagues say, I am a public school educator. In fact, this time last year, I was teaching high school social studies at John F. Kennedy High School before going on to be named the National Teacher of the Year. Something very interesting that I'd like everyone to know, in my year as National Teacher of the Year, there are 4 finalists for this honor that are celebrated in their profession, the top teachers in the nation. Last year, 3 of those 4 finalists went on strike. I would say to you, Mr. Scafidi, if you think this is just about salaries, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. My colleagues from Oklahoma, Washington, and LAUSD went on strike not for salaries, for resources and to make sure their students got what they needed. So I'm interested to learn. I know a lot about education. I know a lot about what the other members of the panel said, but I'm trying to unpack your testimony and perhaps gain some valuable insight. In reviewing your testimony and your previous writings, I found that you spent your career advocating for school choice and for voucher programs. In your 2015 paper, The Integration Anomaly, you argue that for choice to improve integration, it should be free from regulation. We also heard at the start of this hearing that the last thing schools need is more control from Washington. Mr. Scafidi, would you categorize the Individuals with Disabilities Act as a regulation? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Would you categorize Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972 as a regulation?
Yes.
Would you categorize Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a regulation?
Yes.
Would religious private schools that accept vouchers be allowed to ignore any of these regulations on the basis of religious freedom?
In my paper, I advocated, the paper you referred to, that they should have to abide by civil rights laws.
Not what you advocated. Would they be able to ignore any of those regulations?
It depends on the plan. It depends on how the bill is written or the law is written. But I would advocate that they should
Not
follow
what you
civil
would
rights.
advocate, yes or no?
Well, it depends on the law, how the law
Yes,
is
they
written.
would. Do you think that skirting federal civil rights protections that are codified in regulations would help achieve greater integration?
No. I wrote that they should not.
Would it make public schools safer or better for all students
If,
if they were allowed to skirt the regulations?
no.
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 In my time as National Teacher of the Year, one of the things I was able to do was travel all around the country, visit over 40 states, and view firsthand their educational opportunities, experiences, settings for kids. And I promise you, trust me, they do not all look the same, and we don't want to leave that up to states and local municipalities. Can you help explain how it's possible to achieve greater integration through school choice without any of these regulations in place?
Sure. What we've done in this country in public education, and a lot of it's great, is making schools similar. We've equalized funding, which is great, but now states have common standards and common testing, and so schools are becoming more similar. So students are sorting by socio-demographic characteristics in this country. There's my study and another study by some sociologists have found that since 1980 or so, public school segregation increased between then and 2000 by race. After 2000, public school integration has lagged neighborhood integration. Public school integration by income has increased dramatically in this country since around 1970. I think a well-designed school choice program, giving, for example, bigger scholarships to low-income children and what have you, and I list a whole list in my report that you referred to, would promote integration. And I think that's the only best hope to promote integration by race and class in this country in schools.
I'm almost at the end of my time, but I can assure you that I have lived, worked, educated my children in a Title I school district. That was not by choice. For many people, it's their only option. And it sounds like under your plan, this idea that export the highest performers out and keep those people right there will not work. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, and the gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Ms. King, I want to tell you that the most difficult political job I ever had was president of the Town Acres Elementary School PTA. We'll start with that. And anyone who's ever been a school director, your life expectancy is not that long around the country, 3 years, I think. I am a public school proponent. I didn't go to kindergarten, they didn't have one, and the facility I started in was a 2-room country school without indoor plumbing or running water. But I had great teachers, and I want to thank those teachers at that little country school that I started at. And I want to thank the teachers at New Providence Elementary School I went to, and then the high school I went to, because I would not be sitting here today if I did not have a great public education. All of my children went to public schools in Johnson City, Tennessee. And I think when you look at a public school, its product are its students and the outcome of those students and how well they do. That's what we should look at. In a previous life, my wife taught in an inner city school in Memphis when I was in school in Memphis. And it was much different than the rural system. I now represent rural Appalachia, northeast Tennessee, in a very rural area. And I talked to my school director yesterday in my hometown, who was a friend of mine, and I asked him, I said, what are the challenges that you have? And many of you have mentioned some of those. I'll go through them. A limited amount of money for a lot of compliance. Number 2, the way we fund Title I or special education. And 3 for him was the English language learners. We have 14 teachers in our system with 8,000 students that we've had to hire for English, limited English. And that adds a huge burden and cost. Now, having said that, I listened to it sounds like with Dr. Contreras, in their school system, we're not in a wealthy area. But in the last 10 years, we've invested almost $200 million in our schools. We made the tough choices. I was a city commissioner and a local mayor. And we made those tough choices, and we had to raise property taxes to do it. But we believe in education, and we funded that. There are no charter schools in the 1st District of Tennessee. There are faith-based schools in there because of the education that some parents want, and homeschoolers. We've sort of left them out. Some people that don't feel like that the school system is meeting their needs. But no charter schools. And in my district, we've heavily invested in those schools, and it's not just the facility. And I would encourage all of y'all, many of y'all probably have read M. Night Shyamalan's book, I Got Schooled. And he mentions 5 things in his book that are result in good outcomes. One is get rid of ineffective teachers. Not many of them, but if you're ineffective in the classroom, you do damage. Number 2 is get the principal out of the office and put them in the classroom. A good principal in a school is absolutely critical. And then frequent collaboration and feedback on what you're doing. School size, not these big, huge mega schools, but the smaller the school, not necessarily the classroom. And then adding classroom time, making sure the students stay in the classroom long enough. So I think it's a local issue, and Dr. Scavidi, I'd like to have you comment on that. Where the federal government comes in, I know in higher education, our good friends up at Vanderbilt University stated that just complying with federal regulations, if it came on those strings, that'd be one thing, but it all comes with strings, adds $10,000 per student for their tuition, just complying with federal regulations. It's ridiculous. And that goes along where you all are. You spend an enormous, and that's some of that big bar graph you saw. The other is compliance that you've had. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, just in higher ed, at my prior university, an email went out that the university was having a job search for a director of institutional effectiveness. And you know, economists are kind of wiseacres. So one of my colleagues immediately forwarded that email to the rest of us, we'd all gotten it, and said, if you have to have a director of institutional effectiveness, that's prima facie evidence your institution isn't effective. Well, now universities have offices of institutional effectiveness, just a few years later. The compliance in higher ed is terrible. In K-12, it's even worse. And so when I give this talk to local audiences, before I'm done with the first paragraph, the local public educators immediately blame state and federal mandates. I've looked at data, that's not completely true. All 3 levels of government have contributed to the staffing surge, but definitely compliance is an issue. Yes, sir.
Well, I would like to have the educators that are here point out those things, that's something we could do to actually help them have more resources at a local level, is to reduce that somewhat. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I just want to make a couple of comments before I get to my questions. I mean, certainly, I think Dr. Fox is right. You know, sometimes government is not the answer, especially when we have a shutdown that the president bragged he'd be proud to own. So the leadership does make a difference. Secondly, I think it is important for us to understand that education has become the civil rights issue of our time. If you are wealthy, you are guaranteed at least a chance at getting a good education. If you are poor, you are not. We look at Dr. Scaffidi's charts. If you just looked at them in a vacuum, you would assume, oh, we're spending so much more money on education, which in fact is not true. It is true in some places, but not in others, in particular not in my state, where most of my schools get their local funding through property taxes. So if you are a community that does that and you are a poor community, property taxes are not the same anymore. They're going down every year. We are not only not giving more money in most instances, and sometimes we're giving less, especially when we do things like cut the estate tax, which they thought was such a great idea, or we do things like cut corporate taxes, or we do things like say, you know what, you pay too much money for your property taxes. It is not a tax cut, it is a tax shift. And so as it funnels down, local communities get less and less. So they can call it what they want. It is a scam, is what it really is. I want to just say, I was going to actually talk to Dr. Scafidi about some of his charts, but after I heard his answers about what he thinks is onerous, and I thought I'd just ignore it. I do want to recognize I have some sorority sisters sitting out there. How are you all, who have traveled here to hear Dr. Contreras? Dr. Contreras, I'd have a question for you. In your testimony, you say that inadequate facilities, things like broken HVAC systems, et cetera, put students at a competitive disadvantage. Could you explain to me how that is? Is your mic on?
Thank you. Many of our facilities have basic mechanical problems, HVAC problems. As I said, the average age of the facility is 52 years old. We have deferred maintenance needs in the amount of $800 million, and we receive $6 million a year for capital needs, maintenance needs. So we have to take operations money to try to address some basic needs for students. In fact, when I first got to Guilford County, we had a HVAC issue in one middle school that cost $5 million. It took us 3 years to fix the cooling system because it would have totally taking all of our capital money for the year. It would have depleted the budget. So our students are in old classrooms, buildings with technology infrastructure, but without modern technology. The students are collecting the rain in buckets.
Dr. Contreras, I need to just cut you off because I have one other quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we get the point. I bet you could do a whole lot with $1.375 billion. What you think? Okay. Randy Weingart, last question here, quickly. When Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the majority opinion in Brown v. Board, he stated that education was a right that must be available to all on equal terms. We know now that we are more segregated than we probably were in 1968. Can you explain to me how the underfunding of Title I-A and IDEA are creating part of this problem?
Thank you, Representative Fudge. The underfunding, there's a new report by AROS that showed that the underfunding of Title I and of IDEA together leaves about an $580 billion hole. So this is what it means. Our kids who have the least should get the most from the federal government. We know that property taxes, as you just said, exacerbates inequality, but yet some of these districts are doing that because they are trying to fund their schools, as Dr. Rowe had said. But that's where, if it is a civil right, which it is, that is where we need to actually fund the schools in urban and rural areas where kids are not getting what they need. And that is what we thought the Brown decision was intended to do, and that's what we thought IDEA and Title I is intended to do. So guidance counselors, nurses, lower class sizes, the kind of technology you need to have the engagement in career tech ed, Title I issues or IDEA issues. When kids need an individual education plan, how do you actually make that happen other than the compliance?
Well, thank you so much. My time is up, and I just want you to know that that's the law. It's not a regulation, sir. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. And Congresswoman Fudge, you have your sorority sisters here. I know you have them in Bowling Green, Kentucky, because you came to speak at Western Kentucky to your sorority sisters. So you have a wonderful group of sisters. I want to start just Dr. Scafudi. Teacher salary stagnation and the growth of non-teacher staff has gone on a long time. Why do you think this has not been yet addressed?
I think partly people didn't know it was going on. I mean, I got the idea for the paper when I first wrote it from public school teachers. But again, I think there's so many elected officials and government employees at 3 levels of government that have a say in how our public schools are run, that's causing the problem. I'm starting new research to investigate this, and a big issue that I kind of forgot in my 13 layers is the courts. When there's school funding lawsuits periodically in states, and they kind of rotate around to all the states, after a school funding lawsuit is won for more funding for public schools, there's a big increase in non-teaching staff in those schools right after that.
Okay, thank you. And kind of leads me into my next question. You have talked about the inefficiencies in our education system that lead to a misallocation of resources. So maybe this is your next paper you're talking about. Have you looked specifically at what decisions made by federal, state, and local policymakers might be the main drivers?
Again, I'm starting to investigate that, but in some sense, it's all of the decisions. I mean, this has been going on a long, long time, and people have good ideas, legislators and state officials and federal officials, and say, we should do this in the schools or that in the schools, and then it's just layer, layer, layer on top. And that's a choice, right? And that money that goes to increasing staff is not used in other places like building schools or rehabbing schools or salaries.
Okay, thanks. And then you note in your testimony that one of the benefits of addressing the misallocation of resources could be to give every teacher in the country a $12,900 raise. If we could reallocate resources into teacher pay, would an across-the-board increase provide the greatest benefit to teachers and students?
I don't think an across-the-board raise is the right answer. I would support more market-driven pay for teachers, because I think that would get more people to come into the profession, because then people would be paid what they're worth.
Okay. We're looking at it, and I was in the state legislature in Kentucky, and we've struggled with a lot of other states in getting the right formula to our students and to our schools. And our general fund budget, since I first got there, like 2000, was about $14 billion, and that's just property tax that goes to the state government, sales tax, income tax. Last year, I think it was $24 billion. So we've gone up $10 billion, and it's one of the issues we're having here is that so much money is now obligated, particularly Medicaid expansion and so forth, obligates so much money, the room to move and to do the things I think our state citizens say, these are priorities we really want to move forward. So I know our state legislators are struggling. I know they want to make it right. I think we do too, but it needs to be done at the right level. And so a right level of government without putting too much more bureaucracy in place and other things. Because I always say when I was a state legislator, every time we require a report, and there are a lot of bills that say report on this, report on that, report on drop, which are important because if you measure it, you manage it. But it also requires somebody to write the report that's not teaching the students. So those are I'm sure the issues that you're looking at. And I appreciate you all being here. Appreciate you being here for your testimony, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Island, Mr. Sablan.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing, and I thank the witnesses for being present. A caveat, my two youngest are school teachers. One teaches English in the 10th grade, and the other is a special education teacher. And so I do have a little bit of interaction on whenever I'm home with two teachers. But Dr. Contreras, 3 months ago, the students in my district in the Northern Mariana Islands went through Super Typhoon U2, the second strongest storm to hit U.S. soil in history. Multiple schools were lost, which means these students are now going to have their courses in FEMA-built temporary tent classrooms like Quonset huts. Our public school system serves around 10,000 students on 3 islands in the Western Pacific where typhoons are common. You state in your testimony that you have spent time teaching in different schools, districts across the nation. If you and your school district colleagues would design a school at this scale for students in this environment, what elements would you say are the most important?
One moment, she's going to repeat what you said because of my hearing loss. Thank you. I think certainly there are ways to design schools to make sure that you are less likely to experience some of the massive damage that you experienced in your district or that we experienced with 3 of our schools in Guilford County. However, that does take significant funding. You would have to speak to someone who is an expert in that specific design. But I think that speaks to the need for the school funding and for making sure that districts are receiving adequate funding, not just for building schools, but for building schools that can withstand earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, which is more complicated, complex, and does take some additional funding than just renovating a school. That takes significant funding.
Thank you. And I have another question. Not only is the percentage of funding for IDEA actually at its lowest it's been in decades. But we also have a Secretary of Education and a President who failed to prioritize students with disabilities in their annual budgets. In the fiscal year 2018 budget, President Trump proposed a massive cut to IDEA funding, and in the fiscal year 2019 budget, he proposed flat funding, which would have resulted in an essential cut. Schools in the Northern Marianas and across the nation need the resources to train teachers and support students with disabilities. In fact, in the insular areas, the Marianas, Guam, American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands are not included in the special education preschool grant program under IDEA. So Dr. Contreras, how has the deprioritization of IDEA funding impacted students, teachers, and decisions you have made about how dollars are spent?
Absolutely. Not prioritizing IDEA is causing significant problems in schools. In fact, in Guilford County, we have 1 nurse for 1,700 students, and teachers, classroom teachers, are having to catheterize students themselves because we do not have adequate staff to meet student needs. We're not able to handle the transition plans accordingly, and we cannot provide the state-of-the-art kind of instruction and technology that those kids need and deserve to meet their IEP goals. So flat funding would not be a way, in my educational opinion, to meet the needs of the most vulnerable students in the district.
Thank you. I don't mean to cut you off. I do have a question for Ms. King, if I may. Ms. King, can you share from a parent's perspective why it is important to provide more funding to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to support students with disabilities?
Yes. Funding Title I and IDEA would give our children from less disadvantaged schools more resources that they need. We have students in our classrooms, the teacher-to-student ratio is huge. It's much larger. They can't get the one-on-one that they need to be successful, not even with creating their own individual planning for them to be successful inside of their schools. The fact of thinking that children with special needs is not important to put funding to is very difficult to think about as a parent or as a grandparent who actually has a son right now that is classified as having a disability. My daughter is going through things right now to get him help, and to think that we don't think that our students need or have the want, the capability of having any kind of resources of funding is ludicrous to me as a parent.
Yeah, thank you. I will submit other questions for the witness to answer, but we will be holding additional hearings on IDEA and Title I. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Yeah, a few questions. First of all, for Mr. Scafidi, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. There's a popular talk show host in Milwaukee who spells the name the same way. So, just to follow up, I noticed in one of the things that you prepared over a almost 20-year period, staff was going up so much more than the number of students. It looks like nationwide, during a period in which there was an increase in students of 17%, an increase of staff of 39%. Could you comment on that? I mean, it looks to me like either resources are being horribly misallocated or something is going on. I mean, it seems to me if you have that big of an increase of staff, something was going on. Could you comment on that?
Yes, sir. That was a different time period than what I presented today, a little bit shorter time period. But this has been going on for a long, 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 long time. And so if we keep the same system, I don't know why we think it would change. And second, I wouldn't care about the increase in all other staff if we were getting a return. It's not clear we are getting a return on that, and so that's why I argue that's inefficient.
And just to look what I have here, when you're increasing the number of staff by about 40%, when the increase in students is about 17%, that would not indicate a lack of funding, right?
No.
Okay, next question for you. Something that just kind of mystifies me here. In the state of Wisconsin right now, we have a substantial budget surplus. And just doing a quick Google, that's true of other states. Apparently, Ohio has a surplus of hundreds of millions of dollars too. Right now, might have changed in the last couple months, but last time I checked, it looks like this year the federal government's going to be borrowing about 22% of our budget. I mean, irresponsible beyond belief. Could you comment psychologically as to why, when you have two levels of government, the level of government closest to the people running surpluses of hundreds of millions of dollars, and here in Washington, we are borrowing over 20% of our budget already, why, when people feel we need more money for schools, do they think it's the federal government who ought to be kicking in more money when we are broke out of our mind and the states are running surplus? And when the states are closest to the people, so presumably would be able to do a better job of seeing where it should be spent or what ties we put with it.
Yeah, I've actually worked for two Georgia governors, a Democrat and a Republican, and it really rankles them that the federal government can deficit spend seemingly to a large extent, and they have balanced budget amendments in their states.
But why would you, I don't understand it. It scares me when I hear people in education, who are educating the next generation of children, who are apparently coming up here and their role model for young people is ask this completely broken federal government for more money when you're running surpluses locally. It just amazes me that anybody would do that, but comment.
Yeah, it's just a different system. I mean, the federal government can run deficits, the state governments have balanced budget amendments, And it's, it's led to very different outcomes. One has big fiscal problems, and states, balance their budget every year.
Okay. That's true. I mean, it's just kind of a scary thing. Next thing, people talk about teachers' pay, and I don't know, there's one in our papers today, but at least when I have looked at things in the past, frequently you don't take into account fringe benefits. And when you take into account fringe benefits, I mean, very generous health benefits, very generous pension benefits, the gap kind of closes or disappears. Do you think that's true nationwide?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question.
Is that true nationwide?
Yes, sir. Public school employees, and I'm in a public university, we have very generous health and retirement benefits, including retiree health benefits.
That's one of the reasons.
My analysis did not take into account, well, I'm just looking at salary.
Okay, so if you take into account the fringe benefits, maybe things disappear. I will point out it bothers me when people in the education system try to discourage people from getting involved. I remember even when I was a child, I think everybody thinks about being a teacher. I had a teacher who decided to take time out from his class and rip how much he was making. And I think for people who care about education, I think people ought to take that into account.
You're back.
You yield back.
Oh, I yield back, yeah.
Thank you, thank
We're out of time. You can just grab it back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your testimony. Many years ago, when I was a member of the school board, I ran because I was an angry parent, and today I'm an angry grandparent about what's not going on that should be going on. But Dr. Contreras, I want to thank you for all you do to educate our children back home in North Carolina. And, there is no reason why when Guilford County Schools needs more than $1.5 billion in capital investment, that local and state school funding per student in our state has fallen 19.6% since 2008 as of 2015. As Dr. Contreras stated in her testimony, our state has increased public education funding since 2011, but the fact of the matter is it's just not enough. Now, I served as a member of the State House for 20 and a half years, and I've got to tell you that our state legislatures, not just North Carolina, but North Carolina specifically, need to do better. We need to make public education a priority. But we cannot think that our schools can improve our children for the 21st century workforce in an increasingly global economy and still have schools that not only not have up-to-date technology in workplaces, but also threaten the health and safety of our children. Dr. Contreras, can you tell me the last time Guilford County built a new school, and is that school up to model standards and codes? You want to put your mic on? Your microphone, yeah.
I'm sorry. I do not have the date of the last time we built a school, but the latest schools are built to current code and standards. But we have far too few that have been built recently, and about, as I mentioned, about half of them are rated poor, half of the schools are rated poor or unsatisfactory, meaning they need to be rebuilt, or we need to demolish them and build totally new schools.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that Guilford County's stretching dollars for mobile units due to the class size mandate. Is North Carolina not helping counties to fund that mandate?
The state would say they are funding the teachers, but that mandate has required that we increase the number of classrooms by about 940, which causes a problem with facilities. We also are not funded for any of the textbooks, technology, and materials, and 58% of all new teachers in the district are lateral entry, have no formal training because of the mandate.
Okay, so quickly, is learning different in the mobile units versus the mortar buildings, the brick and mortar?
Say that again. In the is there a difference in the
Yes.
mobile units?
In terms of the learning of our children?
I think it is obviously preferable that they were in the building with the rest of the students. Obviously, students are moving in and out of the building in bad weather, and we have students who are very vulnerable students in those mobile units. We are grateful that the tornado occurred on a Sunday because the mobile units were completely destroyed, leveled to the ground.
Right, that's a safety issue too. I've got a lot more I want to say, but I do want to get back to something Dr. Scafati said in terms of all of the increases, but more specifically, the claim about non-teaching staff and their value or non-value. And so, Ms. Weingart, if you just give us your reaction to that, please. Your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Adams. The timetable that Dr. Scafati was talking about also included the timetable of the Individuals with Disability in Education Act and the Disabilities Acts. And those actually required that, or promised that the federal government would spend 40% of those requirements. It only ever spent 16.
Do we need the non-teaching folks?
Right.
That's where I'm going.
This is what it means.
And I've only got
the paraprofessionals, the nurses, the psychologists, the social workers, all of the physical and other kind of hardware and instructional supplies. And all of that, if you did an audit, you would, I think, see that most of the non-teacher increases in schools across America was because of the needs in IDEA.
Thank you very much. And, just one point, we need all of those individuals to help facilitate the learning that has to go on in the classroom. The students do need that support. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Scafidi, your testimony was quite compelling, and I want to go back for a moment to your definition of teachers versus everybody else. Are you aware of any federal definitions that do lay out the difference between in the classroom versus out of the classroom cost in education?
Well, the NCES, National Center for Education Statistics, right down the street, they have a definition of who is a teacher and who is not. And they ask states to report that data to them in that way.
Do those definitions perhaps change from state to state as how they're quantified at the state level versus the
I've worked a lot with
federal
state
definition?
personnel data, and states have what are called job codes. And so each public school employee has a job code. And so states could have different definitions, but they're supposed to conform to the federal definition when they report it to the state.
Okay.
Report to the federal government.
In my state, in the state of Indiana, there's currently legislation working through the state legislature that would provide more transparency when it comes to in the classroom versus administrative costs in education. Is that the answer? Is that the way to go? Greater transparency of these dollar figures to show the American people, in my case, to show Hoosiers the incredible statistics that you shared with us in your testimony, or is there a better way to go? Should we mandate a certain metrics of in the classroom versus administrative cost, in your opinion?
Transparency is a great thing because it lets public school employees, teachers, parents, taxpayers, elected officials see the trade-offs, and then they can make better decisions. So yes.
Do you have any examples of where you've seen that type of transparency effectively drive down that startling a metric that you provided before?
Not yet. There's strong forces against transparency. So.
What are those strong forces?
So often state departments of education, they report spending on their website, how much we spend in public schools, they often exclude funds. In my state of Georgia, we exclude well over $3 billion a year in funding. And so when state legislators are debating education, when the newspaper is talking about how much we spend in public schools, they report the official number that is over $3.5 billion less than the truth. And the website is very Orwellian. It has a spreadsheet. It says, here much how we spend in each district. It has the categories. And then if you scroll down below the spreadsheet, it has a list of included funds and a bunch of fund codes and what they are. Then it has excluded funds and a bunch of fund codes. So we just exclude funding from the total. That seems silly.
Is it, along those lines, is it your opinion that federal mandates and federal involvement in K through 12 education has driven up that everything else category?
If you listen to public school officials at the local level, that's the first thing they'll say. And that appears to be true, yes.
Well, thank you very much. Again, your testimony is quite compelling. I hope to share it with everybody that I know back home because it makes an incredible case for how we can do what we need to do to award teachers the salaries that they deserve for the important work that they do. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your incredible commitment to this issue for so long. I'm a mother of a proud public school kid, and I just want to say thank you so much to all three of you that have done so much work for our public education system. Last week, I met with this amazing group of dedicated teachers from my home state of Washington, and they showed me this very simple but disturbing photograph that echoes what Ms. Weingarten, you mentioned and many of you have talked about, which is a thermostat at 52 degrees Fahrenheit when the kids came in the morning. A teacher at that school, Mrs. Copeland, later showed me a picture of her and a student sitting on a lab bench warming their feet over a hot plate. That's what this is, a hot plate. And she wrote to me and she said, by the fifth period, I didn't care any more about decorum. We had kids huddled over hot plates all day to try to stay and get warm. Sergio came to me asking if he could go to another classroom so that he could get warm. It about broke my heart. Tommy and I both found blankets for our kids, and I brought in any extra warm clothes I had. These are our public schools. These are not shelters, they are our public schools. And it is just crazy to me that we would not be investing everything we can into making sure that our kids and our teachers and our communities have the resources they need. So my first question is to Ms. Weingarten. In your testimony, you expose how teachers are often forced to make do with inadequate and often very dangerous working conditions. Can you tell us why giving teachers more latitude to meet children's needs could improve student achievement and what that looks like? You turn on your microphone.
Sorry. Thank you, Congresswoman. And, there are actually some studies that show that when you have collective bargaining in schools, that teachers can actually sculpt the conditions in their schools to what their kids need. And frankly, they do not start with salaries, as you've heard before. They start with things like nurses and guidance counselors, even though they know that they need higher salaries. But there is a recent EPI study, which we can put in the record, that shows that collective bargaining, especially, frankly, with this ability to strike, actually does far more than any kind of other market conditions to create the conditions in schooling. And so what you see, to answer your question directly, we see teachers of kids with special needs who are out there all the time talking about ensuring that those kids get the instructional materials they need. We see that when the debate was raging about the ACA and Medicaid expansion, it was superintendents and teachers that were out there saying, we need the equipment like wheelchairs, like other kinds of catheterization equipment that Dr. Contreras was talking about, so that kids can be educated in the mainstream. But what happens is that they actually know the needs of their kids and want to start with well-being training and an engagement, and they will often forsake their own salaries in order to actually get the needs that kids need.
Thank you, Ms. Weingarten. I think that was made clear with the teacher strikes, where teachers were not just advocating for their own salaries, they were advocating with the community, with their families, for all of the resources. Ms. King, thank you so much for your moving testimony. I hope you don't ever stop being passionate about schools and education. It is a blessing for all of us. You mentioned in your testimony that from 2010 to 2015, low-income student enrollment grew by 4%, becoming the majority of public school students. Despite the increase in low-income student enrollment, Title I funding for schools has essentially remained the same. So can you tell me how we are supporting today's increasingly diverse learners?
We aren't. More money doesn't mean that our kids are getting educated. As Dr. Scafidi has said on many times, we're having more staff and more funding for these schools. Our schools are crumbling in the education system. Our schools are having more students attend with less money. In Title I school, I am a parent that has had children that graduated from a Title I school. And the school that I serve as a PTA leader right now is a Title I school. And the funding that they have doesn't help them with the needs of the children in the schools. When we're talking about counselors, when we are talking about books in the classroom, technology, and any and everything that we need for our students is important. Title I right now is a big issue across the country with funding. And a lot of people think that the more funding that you get, that your schools will be successful. And they're not, because they don't have a lot of funding, as the person to my left, Dr. Scafidi, has personally stated, that it is working and that we have to have some kind of mechanism to make sure that it's working. Okay, so I'm nervous right now.
No problem. You're doing great. I am out of time. So let me just say that this is, I think, an incredibly important issue. And my state, Washington State, was actually, the state Supreme Court actually ruled that the state was not meeting its constitutional obligation to fund public education way back in 2012. And we finally are correcting that situation and putting more in, but we need Congress to act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, and thank you, panel, for being here with us. I switched chairs, but I'm glad to be able to hear what we're covering in this hearing. One of the first things that I wanted to clear up was, Dr. Scafidi, you indicated in your research that the surge in non-teaching staff in our schools, and point out that this surge hasn't significantly boosted achievement. Many staff in non-teaching positions provide our schools valuable leadership and services. Could you clear up, are you saying non-teaching staff aren't needed, or can you clear that up a little bit, be a little clear about what you see, where you see the real problem is, and of course, like bus drivers and things like that. Can you give us some feedback as far as your research on that?
Yeah, absolutely, non-teaching staff are crucial and essential. But the issue is in what numbers and in what capacities. And so I guess I have to ask, where does it end? That's one reason why I started my data in 1992 in my main analysis, is like Ms. Weingarten said, you know, in the 70s, we started paying attention to special needs students, which was great and long overdue. And that led to a big increase in staff. But it's still going on today, and it's even going on literally in the school year right now, which is after my data. So the question is, where does it end?
As far as, well, my parents were, farmers and educators. My dad served on the Board of Education. We lived education. Growing up, I didn't have a choice. And of course, now, in my role as Republican leader on the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secretary of Education Subcommittee, I'm going to be traveling the country to look at, K through 12 education, see what's being done, what I think, where we're innovating, where we're doing the things we need to do. And then certainly, what I've learned here today, I mean, it's shameful, some of the things that we're seeing here today. But I do want to congratulate you on our success in Georgia. We've had great leadership in Georgia, obviously one of the fastest growing states. We've had 800,000 jobs. GDP, economic growth has a lot to do with education and as far as innovation in education. One of the things I realized in serving on this committee is how do you motivate young people? This one-size-fits-all, top-down approach just does not seem to work. We're seeing that in Georgia. For example, theme schools, things like that really get students motivated. Could you give us a little background on how we're accomplishing so much in Georgia? And because we have, in my district, we pretty much have all new schools. And so can you talk about how you've worked in Georgia to make it what I think is one of the best school systems in the country right now?
Yeah, I could talk too long, but I'll just tell one quick story. In 2003, I used to have lunch every week with Superintendent Kathy Cox, the state school superintendent. I had only been working for Governor Perdue for a couple weeks. And she said, Ben, can you ask the governor if we can move this one position in the State Department to be like the AP coordinator? And I said, yes. And she said, don't you have to ask the governor? I said, well, I'll ask forgiveness later. I said, of course he'll support this. She said, you sure? And I said, yes. She said, well, you have to call the budget director. And so I pulled out my cell phone I called the budget director and said, can you move one position from X to AP? So this person, she was a teacher before. She drove around to every low-income school in Georgia and said, here's how there's state resources and AP, College Board resources to put AP programs in your schools. And so in Georgia now, I wrote a paper on this years later, disadvantaged students and also minority students are more likely to take AP than similarly situated students not in those categories. Florida had the same results. They did it with Jeb Bush. So yes, you can do more if you use your resources quite well.
Exactly, and that's why I mentioned that, again, this top-down, one-size-fits-all concept is not really working. One of the biggest complaints that I hear is where we have funding for X, and the school system needs Y, and they can't do anything about it. So there's very little room to do the kind of things we need to do and innovate. My time's up, and I yield back, sir.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Morelli, for switching spots with me. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for holding this hearing today, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here and for the prepared testimonies and your remarks. In my home state of Georgia, our Governor, Brian Kemp, has called for a $3,000 permanent salary increase for certified Georgia teachers in his proposed budget. In his State of the Union address, State of the State address he delivered last month, he said, and I quote, "To enhance educational outcomes and build a 21st century state, we must invest in those who educate, inspire, and lead our students. To recruit and retain the best and brightest in our schools, we must remove heavy burdens in the classroom and keep teacher pay competitive." Now, I believe this is truly a step in the right direction, and I applaud our Governor Kemp for making the hardworking teachers of Georgia a priority. In 2017, the average teacher salary in Georgia was $55,532, and we are paying our teachers less than the national average. On top of that, in 2015, the Georgia Professional Standards Commission reported that 44% of the state's public school teachers leave the education profession within the first 5 years of employment. To find out why the rate is so high, the Georgia Department of Education in 2015 conducted a survey of 53,000 teachers, and the study included elementary, middle, and high school teachers with varying years of experience. And the results were truly striking. 2 out of 3 teachers who responded to the survey said that they were unlikely or very unlikely to recommend teaching as a profession to a student about to graduate from high school. The teachers also reported that they feel devalued and constantly under pressure. Now, we must address this and we must make sure that we are attracting and retaining the best and the brightest educators in our schools. My question is for Dr. Weingarten. Your testimony speaks to what led to this national movement across the country. And we're seeing that very thing now in Denver. Teachers are galvanized for increased school support. Can you speak to where we are now and the work that's left to ensure the success of teachers?
So teachers, as you were talking, Representative, I was thinking back to when I was the president of the Teachers Union in New York City. And Mayor Bloomberg and I didn't agree on much, but we agreed that in order to have the best and the brightest, there needed to be significant salary increases. And over the course, we just did an op-ed last year on this, over the course of 6 years, we were able to negotiate an increase in pay of 43%, so that people could actually live in the neighborhoods in which they taught, which is what people want. So what you're seeing but what teachers will tell you is that they are very shy about talking about their own wage increases. Mm-hmm. They'd rather work 2 or 3 jobs instead of talk about that. And it could be psychological, it could be, whatever. But they'll tell you there's 2 things, and the research, Ingersoll's research, other research will say, it is about the latitude by which to do our jobs, the conditions we need to actually meet the needs of children. That's number 1. And number 2 is, can we actually pay our bills, including student debt, which is greater and greater, which is why the public service loan forgiveness is so important. And what you're seeing in all these strikes is that people are actually focused on the top of the mind issues. So that's why in Los Angeles, they were focused on nurses in schools, guidance counselors in schools to meet mental health and well-being issues, that the issue of people feeling afraid, as you know so well, about with the safety of communities. So, but it's really, what are the conditions I need to do my job? And secondly, am I being paid enough so that I can afford my student loan issues as well as my own family's needs?
Thank you so much. And I appreciated hearing your remarks about the lack of state funding for public education after the Great Recession. And Dr. Contreras, my question for you, could you talk a little bit more about how underinvestment in the public education system impacts the economy?
I believe that we know that the academic outcomes of students is related to the education of the parents and the socioeconomic status of the parents. So when parents do not have jobs and we are not investing in the community and in schools, you continue to see the sort of persistent underachievement from generation to generation. It is important that we address this situation, or we will be talking about this for the next 50 years.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Scafidi. There's no question that everyone on this committee in both parties want to support every child in public education, and we want to do everything we can to change the schools that are low performing. In your experience, what do we need to know about what works in improving low performing schools, and how should that inform policymakers at all levels?
We should be very humble. I think in the large part, we don't know how to turn around low-performing schools. And even if there's a study that says this one program worked with these 2 schools, that was idiosyncratic. You had one really good guru go in and help turn around those schools, but is that person replicable? So I would be very humble about having any programs at any level of government to turn around, low-performing schools.
As you know, Congress passed the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015. However, the role of testing continues to be debated. What advice do you have for us as we consider the role assessments should play in evaluating school performance?
There's a lot of new research in the last few years, very new research, that these state-based tests, tests created by states or consortium of states, are not super predictive of later life outcomes for students. So I don't know the exact flexibility ESSA gives on testing. I'm not an expert on that flexibility, but I think states should look to switch to more norm reference testing, using tests that have been around a long, long time, instead of these state-based tests. It seems like states aren't great at making their own tests.
Right. And let me say this, I went to public schools, my wife went to public schools, and our 3 children now go to public schools. And it does seem that there's been a big change in teaching from the time when my wife and I were in school compared to our students today. And a lot of people wonder if we are, in public education, spending too much time teaching for the test instead of teaching basic skills. Is that something that you've encountered in your research?
Well, I've encountered that in real life. For 9 years, we lived in a rural area in Georgia, and about day 3, my kids, when they were in 2nd grade, my 2 oldest, they were scared of something called the CRCT, right, the Criterion Reference Competency Test. But here's the rub. I don't think policymakers, the business community, parents want to go back to the 1990s where we just sort of give a bunch of money to the public education system and say, we're going to trust you. I think schools are going to be held accountable one way or the other. And it's either going to be through some kind of centralized system like we do now, or it's going to be through a decentralized system where parents hold schools accountable directly when they make choices of where to go to school. And we just got to pick as a society, what do we think is best for students?
And I certainly support public education and have a lot of respect for teachers. I believe classroom teachers are underpaid when you consider the education that they're required to have to teach, as well as the number of students, and they can't pick or choose which students they want to teach, like in many private schools. Public school teachers inherit whatever they are given. And because of that, I've always had great respect for teachers. My mother was a public school teacher. One of the things that I've noticed with respect to teachers' pay in the school systems in Kentucky, in my congressional district, and Congressman Guthrie touched on this a little bit, is the fact that the budgets have actually increased, even though teachers' pay, classroom teachers' pay, has not increased significantly. And it appears in most school systems, in Kentucky anyway, that the highest salaries, aside from the superintendent, are in the central office. And I've always believed that, and when I say central office, I'm talking about administration, I've always believed that the 3 highest paid employees in the school system should be the superintendent, the principal, and the classroom teachers. Because many classroom teachers are like me in business, or most Americans want to make the most money. And I feel like we need to reprioritize where we pay the highest salaries in public education.
I think if we had a choice-based system of education, the compensation across different types of public school employees would be very different. And I think their most important staff, the teachers, would be the big winners.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for being here to address this very important subject. I'm the mother of 2 children who are now in their 20s. Both of them were educated in a very fine public school district in Pennsylvania, which happens to be immediately adjacent to a very distressed school district. And I worked in the school district that was distressed. I went home to the school district that was better funded and where the children's outcomes were significantly better. So I feel as though, at least from the outside, I've seen it. Ms. King, I also want to thank you for your role with the PTA. I was very active in my children's schools' PTO organizations throughout their elementary school years until my children banned me from ever entering their school when they got to middle school, at which point I stopped. But it's important work that is done. There are so many questions that could be asked here, but I want to direct my first question to you, Dr. Contreras, because by my count, you have either taught or been in 5 different school districts over the course of your career. Is that correct? Yes? And Illinois, Georgia, Rhode Island, New York, and North Carolina. So I assume you have seen some schools that have better funding than others. Is that fair to say?
With respect to facilities, I have.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you speak just to that issue then? The issue, what you have seen based on your personal experience in 5 different school districts about how the students do when they have better facilities?
So I will say that I have dedicated my career primarily to working in poor communities, but there are some states that do contribute more to funding their capital needs. So in Georgia, I did see that the school facilities were much newer and that students had a greater opportunity to participate in career technical education programs because of the educational suitability. So it wasn't just a matter of maintaining the buildings, they actually could participate in programming that helped them with career education and, career college readiness. I just implore us all to not simply look at data, which is important, but also to believe what we see with our own eyes and hear from the 1/6 of the U.S. population that spends 8 hours in our schools every single weekday, who are telling us that they are struggling with dilapidated schools with significant environmental issues. And that's what I've seen primarily throughout my 26, 27 years in education.
And do you consider digital connectivity to be part of a school's infrastructure?
It is absolutely necessary, yes.
And have you taught in school districts where the students did not have access to computers or laptops or whatever?
Absolutely. So I'm in a district where we have 100% connectivity, but the students do not have devices.
And what about those same students when they go home? Do you have any kind of information, even anecdotal, about their ability to access the internet and other learning tools?
We know that quite a few of the students do have internet connectivity or access to the internet. We don't know about their access to devices, but in primarily poor areas, this is going to become an issue for our families. So not only do they not have access in school in many communities, they go home and they also do not have access, widening the opportunity gap for these children.
Thank you. I have one series of questions, or one question for Dr. Scafidi, if I may. Your written testimony and your testimony today talks about the big increase in all other staff. What kinds of employees do you include in all other staffs? Do you include librarians?
Yes.
And school psychologists?
Yes.
Guidance counselors? Reading specialists?
Yes, ma'am.
Tutors?
Yes, ma'am.
School bus drivers?
Yes, ma'am.
So all of those fall into that all other staff category as well?
Correct.
Do you dispute that any of those categories are necessary in today's schools?
No, I do not.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this hearing, and this is certainly an important topic. I know in my time in the state legislature, I was a very strong advocate for increasing teacher pay, and it was incredibly frustrating to me to see what, Dr. Scavidi, you really pointed out here in your testimony today. And I think there's confusion about this. I mean, even in this hearing, I hear confusion about this. I mean, so in 1992, we were spending $5,626 per child. And then in real dollars in 2016, we're now spending $13,847. So in real dollars, on a per-child basis, in public education in America today, we're spending a lot more than we were when I went to public school, right? Is that a fair statement or surmise from your testimony so far?
That is correct.
Okay, so we're spending a lot more money on public education on a per-child basis in real dollars since when Van Taylor was in public school back in the 80s, right? So what's frustrating to me is that teacher pay is basically flat. So we're spending more, but teacher pay is flat. And so, and again, there's confusion about that. I mean, even in this hearing, I've heard people saying, sort of saying, well, we're cutting, we're not investing enough. Well, we are investing more and more and more, but it's not going to the teachers. And I was very frustrated in my time in the legislature. I was very, very happy that this legislative session, the governor of Texas and the speaker and lieutenant governor made it an emergency item and said, this is something really important. We're going to pay teachers more as they try to restructure student education. So do parents, Dr. Scafidi, in your experience, do parents understand that the funding is going up, but it's not going to the teachers? I mean, it's clear to me that some of my colleagues don't understand that, but do parents understand that in your experience, in your time in Georgia or elsewhere?
Yeah, in my experience, talking to parents when I was working at the state level, but also just in my kids' public schools, parents do know about the increase in all other staff. They talk about the number of assistant principals, curriculum specialists, curriculum directors. They do witness that. I'm not sure they know about the increase in real spending.
And why is that? I mean, and I've had that, I mean, I'm very blessed to represent some really phenomenal public schools in my district, and I refer to them frequently as the crown jewels of my community, and they're clearly the driving force for why I represent a successful district or why I have a successful community. We have got great public schools. But even then, I find a lot of confusion about the actual funding per child. There's a lot of confusion about what is spent. I hear people that really should know better saying, oh, we're spending $7,000 a kid, or we're spending, and then when you do the math, you do the total dollars divided by the number of kids and the per capita, it's very different. Why is, and actually you spoke a little bit about that earlier, about excluding certain numbers, excluding certain funds. Can you speak more about that in your experience?
Yes, and I'll tell another true story. One time when I was sitting at my office, we had caller ID and the phone rang. It said, call transfer from the president of the university's office. I was like, oh no, what do I do now? Right, answer the phone. They said, call transfer. I said, okay. And the person said his name, I thought this was made up. He said his name was Mick Zase, the state school superintendent of South Carolina. And so I'm quickly Googling it because I thought it was one of my friends pranking me, but that's a real person, actually. And I believe he's up here now. He said, you wrote this report, Dr. Scafidi, and it says we're not telling the feds how many people work in our public schools. I said, well, yes, you guys have not told us how many people work in your public schools for decades. And he said, what? I'm going to fix that. I said, okay. So he said, what do I do? I said, have a transparency button on the homepage of your DOE website at the state level, and just have 3 or 4 graphs that are very easy to understand. Show the increase in spending, show the increase in staff relative to the increase in students, things like that. Make it really simple so that parents and taxpayers and elected officials can know this. And he did that, but then he left office, and I went to go get that link because I was going to put it in a paper, and the link was there, but it said the page had been taken off. We just need very simple transparency, and then people will understand.
Sure, and I appreciate this hearing and its purpose because the key to a great education is parental involvement. And Ms. King, I appreciate your involvement as a parent. I approve the PTA members are so important for our public schools in Collin County, and it's local control and it's great teachers. And if you're not paying teachers enough, you're not going to have great teachers. So I think it's really a question of local districts making the investment in teachers. Mr. Chairman, I kneel back.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, first of all, for holding this critically important hearing and for all the work that you're doing. And also thank you to the panelists for being here. All of you make significant contributions. And if it's okay, I'll give a special shout out to Ms. Weingarten for her long leadership in my home state of New York and all the incredible contributions she's made and is now making nationally. In my district, Rochester, New York, I, as a state legislator, authored 2 different phases of school modernization, totaling probably about $800 million in construction dollars, something I'm proud of, but really scratches the surface of what we need to do in one urban school district in upstate New York, which has just shy of 30,000 students. But school modernization and school reconstruction is beyond just brick and mortar. And I'm sort of interested, Dr. Scafidi, in some of the things you said, which I found fascinating. But I actually take a different, I guess, reach a different conclusion than you might or others have. I think it's important to look at the expansion of non-teaching personnel in the schools. But to me, the importance of that is sort of drilling down and figuring out why. People just don't hire folks for no reason. And I thought, Ms. Weingarten, your comments relative to it were right on point in the sense that there are other needs now, and that's sort of what I want to get into. More and more in areas of high poverty in particular, there are multiple needs that children face, family needs, needs that the schools weren't intentioned to have to deal with, nor do they necessarily have the expertise or the authority. So bringing more services into the schools, where kids, frankly, are a lot of the day, seems to me part of the rationale for the increase in the non-pedagogical staff there. So that's just my comment about the testimony that you gave, and I think it is important, but I reach, I think in my mind, a different conclusion. Child poverty in Rochester ranks 3rd in the nation, and something that we're, even as we're rebuilding the schools. But I wanted to ask Ms. Weingarten, if I might, in your testimony, you talked about the importance of fully funding Title I to support schools that serve poor students. And I just wanted to get your thoughts as I was talking about health services, social services, human services, educational services, all sort of combining. How important are those resources? When you think about particularly low-income schools, just your thoughts on trying to combine those services, integrating them, and how important that is in the welfare and the development of children.
So number one, I want to give a shout out to Chairman Scott and those who did ESSA, because they read and saw the research then, and that is why they kind of re-envisioned and recreated Title IV of ESSA, which is specifically intended to fund these things. The Aspen Institute and frankly, any school teacher, Congresswoman Hayes will tell you this as well. We have shifted to thinking about the well-being of children as first and foremost. You need to meet the needs of children before you can get to their instructional needs. And so that's part of the reason why schools that have these panoply of services, community schools, mental health services, physical health services, after school, child care, are really important in terms of not just custodial care, but to the social economic well-being of kids. And so that is absolutely imperative. There's a lot of research around that.
I very much appreciate that. Also, it seems to me, and I had the benefit of being married to what is now a retired middle school teacher, and I think, no disrespect to elementary or secondary education teachers, but I think there's a special place in heaven for middle school teachers. I did want to ask Ms. King, and thank you for your testimony, but in your mind, what does effective family engagement in the schools look like? Your microphone, I'm sorry.
Get to this. Because I want to read something that we have from National PTA. National PTA believes that there are 4 guiding principles to effective family engagement. First is inclusive, so that all families are valued and engaged. Second is individualized to meet the unique needs of each family and student. Third, it is integrated into the school system as part of a job responsibility, calendars, and instructional priorities. Lastly, it's impactful so that all families have the information and tools to make their child's potential a reality. So as a parent, what that says to me is that family engagement is a two-way communication. It empowers and it engages between families and the schools. Families no longer are being viewed as an enemy, but as a child's partner with the teachers and the staffs inside of the schools. And by engaging and empowering families and parents in a meaningful way, and including families on decision makings on the committees, not because you're told to, because you want to, says a lot, and that you are valued, and that your voice matters. So anything that involves family engagement is a plus for a school.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here today. And I want you to know that I, too, get a little passionate about this issue. My late wife was a school teacher, and a darn good one. My dad was a school teacher, went back and got his master's in counseling and guidance, became a high school counselor. I've always supported public schools. I served on the board of directors of the Education Foundation in Mansfield, Texas. It was a great experience. We engaged the private sector, engaged businesses, and raised and continue to raise millions of dollars and gave away millions of dollars for teacher grants in the Mansfield School District, and greatly enhanced what they were able to do. Because I can tell you that there were times that my wife and I dipped into our own personal bank account to benefit her classroom. And I think that story plays out all over America with every public school teacher probably in the country. But I also get passionate about when school children are denied the quality education they could have because of bad decisions and sometimes downright stupidity of adults when it comes to allocating education dollars. And Dr. Scafidi, the information you provided today is disturbing, although I can't say I'm shocked by it. But one of the most salient facts is the fact that since 2016, the majority of public school employees in the United States are not teachers. Well, that kind of hits home with me. And that we've had these increases in spending across the country that didn't go to teachers, didn't go to the classroom. And I know that there's a lot of jobs in every school district that are important to the education of school children. I'm not going to argue that point, but I would say that when the majority of employees are not teachers, it's upside down, because they're the ones that are delivering more than anybody else the education. They're the ones that are spending time with those students. And so I share my colleague from Collin County's frustration with the level of spending that goes to children. And I will tell you that if school districts are, and I know that a lot of this 736% non-teacher employees are administrators, and I'm not here to beat up administrators. I know they're important too. But I also know there's been a huge spike, a huge increase in the number of administrators vis-a-vis teachers. Would you know what that number is or what that percentage is?
I do not.
Okay. Well, we both know it's a significant number. And here's the thing. Because all of us on this committee want a quality education for every child in America. There's no question about that. How we deliver that is something we can have an honest debate about. But if a school district or state is choosing to spend their money on more administrators instead of teachers, that's a bad decision, in my opinion. If they are spending more money on administrators, from additional administrators, than fixing the plumbing in their buildings, that's a bad decision, in my opinion. So my concern with what we're talking about today, and Mr. Chairman, I applaud the good intentions of what you're trying to achieve, is there's no accountability here. And we're going to wind up subsidizing the bad decisions that have been made when it comes to the allocation of education dollars at the local and state level. As Mr. Taylor just mentioned, in the state of Texas, we have, right now, our legislature is meeting, and the state Senate, they've already filed a bill to increase teacher pay by $5,000 a year. That's a good thing. But this, what we're talking about today, these grants don't do anything to impact the performance nationwide of students, and that should be the goal, to improve student performance. And let me tell you, I get it as far as how crumbling infrastructure can affect the environment of people, student and teachers alike. I was in high school before I ever attended a school with air conditioning, and if you haven't sat in a classroom in August in Texas, believe me, you'll appreciate air conditioning. So I get it, believe me. But there's no accountability here. And the last thing Congress should be doing is subsidizing bad decisions that have been made at the local level. And I have a real problem with that. Let me ask you, based on all the studies you've seen, is there any correlation between student performance, improvement in student performance, and additional administrators?
Not to my knowledge.
Is there a study that, I mean, intuitively we all know this, but is there a study that would indicate any correlation between student performance and the quality of the infrastructure of a classroom or a school building?
The evidence on that is mixed, and I think that's because of what Dr. Contreras said, is in some areas we need more and better facilities, and some we don't.
Well, I would certainly, advocate for air-conditioned buildings in Texas. I can, based on my own experience.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many things. You put an educator on the Education and Labor Committee. You should see the notes I have in this paper. So I'm going to try to reel myself in so that I don't run down my time. I didn't realize that one of my colleagues that I spoke about earlier, Sean Sheehan from Oklahoma, is in the room. I'm glad you're here. We hear a lot about regulations, and Mr. Scafidi, you talked about how schools should be free from regulation. So not a question, a statement. I'm glad that my colleague, Marcia Fudge, brought in the fact that these are not regulations, these are laws. That's what I was getting to. So just rest on this for a minute. If you had to rank order which laws you would move out of the way so that schools of choice could move along more quickly and move some of the regulations, would it be the laws that provide equitable access to women and girls under Title IX? Would it be the laws that require that we provide equitable access for students and children with disabilities under IDEA or ADA? Which student protections are we willing to gut in order to make these schools a lot more profitable? The next thing I would ask you, and Mr. Scafidi's testimony argues that a $41 billion investment would give over 5 million children scholarships to attend private schools of their choice. My question for everyone on the panel, and it doesn't require an answer because I think it's self-evident, what happens to the other 45 million children that attend our public schools? What happens to those kids? So finally, I come from a state where we have the largest equity gap in the country. My district houses some of the wealthiest and some of the poorest communities. We're talking about bringing it back down to the local level. One thing that I will agree with Mr. Scafidi on is that we need to listen to teachers and the people who are closest to the pain or closest to the solutions. We have some valuable information to provide, so I guess there is some value in having a teacher on this committee. What happens if there's no school in the area that I'm living in that decides to cater to students with disabilities? How does a student in a city like Waterbury, Connecticut, not get left behind in this type of a system? And then I think more importantly, because this is the thing we haven't talked about, we talk about the connection with, Ms. King, you talked very eloquently about the role of parents and the role of communities. What happens to a kid who doesn't have a parent who knows how to advocate for them? Anyone who's heard me speak knows that my grandmother raised me. My grandmother didn't drive. She had a 5th grade education. My mother was an addict. Am I not entitled to a high-quality public education? Who's advocating for me and children like me? If what we're saying is only the people with the loudest voice and the biggest megaphone and who live in the best communities should have the best public education, isn't it our role as legislators, as educators, as leaders to advocate for the people who don't have a voice? Just yes or no? Yeah. I'm sorry, because I too, Ms. King, am very passionate about this. So as we are talking about these things, I hear everyone talk about the level of respect they have for teachers. Everyone has a teacher in their family. So if we respect teachers and we respect public education, why aren't we looking at it as an investment? And I think the thing that we are all confused about in this room, I agree with my colleague, there is some confusion, but about something very different. The confusion lies in the fact that we are thinking that it's one or the other, pay teachers or improve facilities. I want both. I want both. It's not a trade-off. We're not talking about hire more staff or improve facilities and conditions. I want both. We're talking about this from an economic standpoint in dollars and cents. That's not what education looks like. This is not an economist's problem, and I appreciate what you bring, but if we're looking at it as a business, if we're treating education and schools like corporations, then I would say we also need a $2 trillion bailout. We need for government to save teachers, to save schools. We'd like that bailout. In this last tax plan, the $250 that I used to be able to claim as an educator to offset the thousands of dollars that I spent in my classroom was taken away. So if you truly value education and you truly value teachers, then why are we continuing to take away and saying, but we appreciate you? This is a profession. This is not mission work. We deserve the same rights, protections, benefits, fringe benefits, don't even let me go there, as every other profession. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Musser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all very much. An extremely qualified, knowledgeable panel. I thank you. I'm certainly getting educated here myself, so it's very appreciated. As my friend just mentioned from Connecticut, a good teacher has a profound effect on our children. Great teachers have a profound effect on our society. My 3 children, I've one in high school, public high school, and my daughters are older, but I would ask them at least 2 or 3 times a week, how are your teachers? Tell me which one of your teachers are great, which ones are good, and which ones maybe not so much. It's probably one of the most important things outside of parenting. So we certainly all agree with that. But I also believe, and I think we would agree, that this is more about students, not so much, the teachers and the staff. So I certainly believe teachers deserve to be paid very well. I think our young people should have modern schools. We're an affluent society for the most part, and I think these modern schools should certainly exist in every school district. That should be without exception, and that I find unacceptable when that's not the case. We do, however, must also have respect for the taxpayers that expect results and expect achievement in our students due to the high level of spending that does in fact take place. There have been, over the last 15 years, federal increases, and the numbers are the numbers, have gone up over 30%, federal dollars. In Pennsylvania, the state general fund increases hundreds of millions every year. We have a school property tax situation in Pennsylvania that is getting to be unmanageable for many taxpayers. School property taxes just going through the roof, forcing people to move, many retired people. Pensions are something that certainly comes up and needs to be managed better, and it's billions of dollars in Pennsylvania alone. and this issue that comes up with the growth of non-teacher staff. I agree some is necessary, but I think we might all agree probably not all. And then when Mr. Scafidi, my apologies, brings up that with 37% increases per student since 1992 after inflation adjustment. So now granted, computers cost more than notebooks, and get all that, but we've got a lot of money going into this very important investment. So my question, and I'll start with Mr. Scafidi, is are our children now receiving a better education than 20 years ago?
In terms of national test scores, it doesn't appear to be so. Just a little history. From 1970 to 2000, actually public high school graduation rates fell in this country in a very stark way. But in this century, they've actually come back up. So in that respect, things have improved. But so we're kind of slightly higher than we were in 1970 now, even though we're spending a whole lot more money. But you would expect the high school graduation rate to go up given changes in the economy, because there's been a big return to high-skilled jobs. So more people, students on their own, should be rationally choosing more education. So on balance, I think the evidence is weak that schools are a lot stronger than they were decades ago.
What about versus other countries? I've seen the data, seen the rating systems, asking your opinion.
Yeah, it's in terms of if you compare the U.S. compared to other rich countries, we're very mediocre on achievement.
Okay. Why do you think that is?
Lots of things. I mean, definitely it's probably culture. But also I think we could be getting more for our education dollars in our current education system if we change it.
Okay. And my other question is really to the full panel, if I could. Is there a model that exists out there in a particular state or school system that one could use to improve our overall system? And overall question is there a better way? Is there a better way? I leave it to the panel, but I'll start with you, Mr. Scafidi.
Start with?
The question is to you. Is there a model that you admire and that should be followed?
I think Arizona and Florida have increased choice significantly. They still don't have a whole lot when you compare it to other countries that have choice, but their NAEP score gains have been impressive.
So I would disagree, Dr. Scafidi. I would just actually look at Massachusetts. If you look at all the states in the nation, the state that has actually done more in terms of investment on both standards and the teaching of standards, not the testing, is Massachusetts. But I would also go back to the 50-some-odd years of Title I, the Johnson program, the Kennedy-Johnson program against poverty. And what you see is a huge increase in achievement of kids who are underprivileged in the first 25 years when you saw the kind of spending that was done at that time. And then you saw somewhat of a stagnation because of the fixation on testing and accountability as opposed to the investment that Representative Hayes was talking about. And what your colleagues did with ESSA, led by Mr. Scott and others, was to try to get to that flexibility on a local level to mimic, to try to replicate the results that we saw in the first 25 years with having appropriate oversight. And what you're starting to see is an increase again in graduation rates, particularly in the C-Tech programs. C-Tech programs where you have real engagement with students, you see two things. You see increased graduation rates, and you see lots of kids who go to career technical education also then go to college.
Thank you. Sure, if you wouldn't mind.
Very briefly,
Chairman
because the
allows.
gentleman's time has expired, very briefly. If,
Thank you. I believe that if we continue to invest in our teachers through fair compensation and also making sure they have mentors and professional learning opportunities, if we provide wraparound supports for those teachers so that they can teach. And I just want to clarify that each state categorizes licensed professionals differently. So in the state of North Carolina, a homebound teacher who is a teacher who teaches students every day is not categorized as a classroom teacher, but they are still a teacher. That's true of the social workers, of the counselors. So 73% of all of our staff are teachers and TAs and supporting students, providing direct services. So I believe the more we provide support for teachers and leaders, that's the model for improving outcomes for students, while we simultaneously provide wraparound services in the form of making sure that we continue to fund food programs for these children, making sure they have physical and mental health programs in schools, and making sure they have social workers, counselors, and other support staff.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Federal investment in public schools is absolutely essential. And in my community in Illinois, we also have higher state and local taxes that goes towards funding our amazing public schools, like Neuqua Valley High School, where I went to school. But when I was home last weekend, I heard from so many of my neighbors whose tax bills skyrocketed this year because of the Republican tax law. The Republican tax law limited the state and local tax, or SALT deduction, which helps offset the taxes we use to pay for public schools. Our community doesn't mind paying our taxes, but we expect a return on our investment. We want our tax dollars going to our children's schools, not to tax cuts for corporations. Ms. Weingarten, can you please describe how limiting the SALT deduction impacts public schools, especially in states like Illinois that have higher local taxes to fund public education?
Oh, thank you, Representative Underwood. And what we've seen for the first time in the tax code is that the states that actually thought about the Lockean social good, social compact are now being hurt because of it. So that states that actually invested in public safety, safe streets, and public education and public services, where their constituents paid state and local taxes for that, they now are subject to double taxation on that. And that we're seeing that in California, in Illinois, in New York, in Connecticut, and in New Jersey. And, you know, so there were real losers in the last tax bill. It was not simply that the rich got richer, but that those states that actually believed in that are seeing real limitations. New York, for example, there's about a $2 billion drop in revenues. And one of your colleagues earlier talked about an increase in revenues in some of the other states, but in the states that actually really made this commitment, there's a drop. And many of us are trying to see if we can go back at this, because this is really a defiance of federalism.
Some versions of the Republican tax law also eliminated tax deductions for teachers who spend their own money to buy classroom supplies, as my colleague just outlined. Thankfully, that provision was not in the final law, but placing this financial burden on teachers is not sustainable long-term. Ms. Weingarten, almost every public school teacher pays for classroom supplies out of their own pocket, right?
There's all these studies that show that on average, it's about $480. For Title I teachers who actually teach poor kids, it's higher. And you will hear many stories from myself and others about the thousands of dollars that we have spent on our kids.
Yeah. Now more than ever, it's clear that students and teachers need support from the federal government. Last month, I sent a letter to the IRS asking them to help families in our community and across the country who are being hurt by the limited SALT deduction. In addition, though, the Republican tax law, as you outlined, does need a legislative fix from those of us in Congress. As my colleagues and I work on legislation to stop the limited SALT deduction from hurting students and teachers, in your opinion, and this goes to the panel, what other fixes to the Republican tax law should we be looking at? And we can start with Dr. Contreras.
I'm sorry, I would have to supplement the record. I don't have the information.
Thank you. Ms. King?
I don't have any information as well.
Okay. Sir?
I'm not an expert on tax policy.
Okay. Ms. Weingarten, did you have anything else to add?
So what I would add, Representative Underwood, is that there are, we went into huge deficit spending to create this artifice of trickle-down economics. What happens if some of that got moved to the spending of infrastructure, like Representative Scott and others, Chairman Scott and others have suggested? The kind of real priming the pump that would do if we actually took $1 trillion that went for tax cuts and moved them to the kind of spending that Chairman Scott and others are talking about, that would create good jobs all throughout the country, that would deal with the crumbling infrastructure, not only in our schools, but throughout our society, and it would actually create a real economic engine.
Ma'am, as you describe, it's a reinvestment in our local communities. Thank you so much. I yield back the remainder of my time to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on underfunding public schools and how it shortchanges students in America. I represent a large part of the Clark County School District in Nevada, one of the 5th largest school districts in this country. We have infrastructure challenges of somewhat a different sort. Average class sizes in our school district are the largest in the country at 25.86 students per teacher. 230 of our 336 schools are at or above capacity, and 24 schools are year-round. 21,000 students now are forced to take online classes. All the while, our school district projects $8.3 billion is needed for capital improvements, not including deferred maintenance. And I want to thank all of you for, first of all, your commitment to education, commitment to our students. And I want to ask Ms. Weingarten, given the chronic underfunding of education, can you address how inadequate funding of schools exacerbates overcrowding and how this impacts student success?
So as you just talked about, Representative Lee, when you have that level of overcrowding in a school, there are lots of different impacts to it. Number one, the kind of courses that Dr. Scafidi talked about. I taught AP government. I taught my Title I kids bioethics. You're not going to be able to have the space in a school to be able to do those classes, and because they may not be part of the core instructional requirement to get to a diploma. So they will always fall off. Number two, band, music, those kinds of things. So course electives that are why kids actually come to school, you're not going to have. Number two, the issues about infrastructure, both technology as well as crumbling facilities, very much impact kids. Take the health and safety issues of mold, of ventilation. That, for many kids who have respiratory illnesses, that really impacts kids. And then the issue that Representative Morelli raised earlier, if you actually can, and that Dr. Contreras raised, if you actually wrap services in a school, you need some places for those medical services and things like that, which are not there. But when you have those services, that actually hugely helps kids. So those are just some off the top of my head impacts.
Thank you. Speaking of wraparound services, you've publicly stated numerous times your support of the community schools strategy, especially in schools serving a high percentage of students living in poverty, which unites resources and assets of the school, family, community through strong partnerships facilitated by a coordinator and at the school site, which ensures student success. As the former president of Communities and Schools of Nevada, I couldn't agree with you more. Your organization has directly supported the strategy in McDowell County, West Virginia, the poorest county in West Virginia. Can you tell me what you discovered there about the county's needs and how this community school strategy is an effective way to bring about collaboration needed to increase investment and resource alignment at our schools?
So first, I would invite any person on this panel to come visit the McDowell County schools with us. McDowell County, like some of the schools that some of the other representatives have testified about, is right in the middle of Appalachia. It's former coal mining. It's a former coal mining county. It's the 8th poorest county in America. It's a county that's been afflicted by opioid addiction. After all sorts of other top-down ways of trying to create better outcomes for kids, the then governor's wife, Gail Manchin, asked us to take over the schools. We said we don't believe in privatization. We could do, though, a public-private partnership. And so for the last 6 years, the AFT has done a public-private partnership with the McDowell County schools and others. And in those years, we have increased graduation rates over 12%. We have doubled the number of kids who are going to college. We have wrapped services around various schools. What we haven't been able to do is create jobs. But the other emotional and instructional impacts, we have been able to change outcomes for kids. And so when you see kids who used to actually look down, never talk to adults, now talking about how they can use Lego to create, to code themselves, that's what I consider success in schooling.
Thank you. I do agree. I mean, you know, some of our site coordinators are in closets in some of our schools, and it really comes down to having that personal relationship, and you need to have space to have personal relationships. So thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. My colleague from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the underlying theme in this hearing, both sides can agree on, is that education matters. Having access to good education at an early age exponentially opens opportunities for students and can accelerate a student's trajectory. And while we consider solutions, we have to remember that just as each student is their own individual, each school and school division is as well. And painting them with a broad brush and trying to push money and regulations that have no ability to be customized does a disservice not only to those schools and those students, but also to the taxpayers who are funding fixes that do not actually seek to fix the underlying problems. So I'd ask Dr. Scafidi, what inefficiencies do you see at the federal level that can be eliminated to make room for state and local solutions?
I would ask school superintendents in your state and school board chairs what federal regulations are causing them to misallocate funds. Ask them directly, and I think they'll talk to you for a long, long time.
And we heard from your testimony about the top-heavy administrative trend. The impact on students is felt through, among other things, larger class sizes because resources have to be allocated to that administrative burden. What other trends, what other impacts on students does this misallocation of resources have?
Yeah, it's an opportunity cost. I mean, money spent on A is money that can't be spent on B. And there's lots of worthy Bs. And so the question is, if what we're spending on doesn't seem to be moving the needle, we should reallocate those dollars. And that's going to differ in different communities. It's going to differ for different students, like you were saying about customization. Certain kids need different things, and we shouldn't have one-size-fits-alls from the federal government, from the state governments, or even within school districts, or even within schools. So it's going to change depending on the student's needs.
In fact, can you see perhaps an inverse discouragement of states and local governments from addressing some problems with an allocation of federal resources that might be inefficiently applied or inefficiently allocated that can disincentivize action at the state or local level?
Yes, two things. I do worry that if there was a big federal infrastructure spending bill, that it might not hit where it's needed most in terms of schools. Second is, yes, if states and school districts have federal money coming in, that might take the pressure off from them using their own money for those items, and so they might choose not to spend as much, say, on infrastructure or what have you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. We flew to Detroit, circled, and flew back, so we never landed for our colleague's funeral. Ms. Weingarten, under the administration's proposals to drastically cut the education budget, dozens of schools in Miami-Dade County will lose close to $500,000 in funding for after-school programs, and teachers of the district could see more than $17 million in cuts for professional development. The administration has repeatedly said that eliminating funding for after-school programs is correct due to lack of evidence that such programs improve student achievement. Can you comment on that and on the importance of after-school programs? And I think the superintendent might want to comment as well. Thank you.
So the administration, anytime the administration says this, it says to me that they actually haven't spent a minute with children. So part of the administration talks about how important childcare is and wanting to give deductions for childcare, but then when you do it in an organized way by having after-school programs or summer programs where you both have instruction and custodial care, you get a double value for that funding. So why would they cut this off? This is money that frankly, every wealthy parent will do, spend money in terms of after-school care and in terms of piano lessons, ballet lessons, but why don't we give this to our kids who can't afford it? This is what Representative Fudge was talking about earlier in terms of civil rights, civil rights responsibility. So there is a lot of research on this. The Aspen Institute just put research out on this. Others put research out. I don't know why they're saying that there isn't, but at the end of the day, this is the heart of what we think about schools. Schools should be centers of community. There should be wraparound services. They should be open for a long period of time, and so that parents can actually have both and can actually see that their kids are safe after school, as well as having great instructional opportunities after school and in summer school, as well as during school.
Dr. Contreras.
Thank you. Proposed cuts to after-school programs would have a significantly negative impact on our school district and the most vulnerable children in the district who participate in these programs. Many of these students who are participating are exposed to toxic stress, such as experiencing violence or witnessing violence, having parents who may be incarcerated, the death of a parent, poor academic outcomes. They have high levels of trauma and experience a great deal of adverse childhood experiences that negatively impact their overall well-being. We work very closely with our partners who provide these after-school programs like Communities in School, and they align their programming to our academic program as well as provide other kinds of supports for these children and experiences. So cutting these programs would have a very negative impact.
Thank you. Ms. King?
For poor students, after-school programs allow them to escape the streets. And if children who cannot afford extra activities during school or after school, they have an opportunity to participate in something that will keep them safe, whether it's mentoring programs after school where they could learn, whether it is a possibility of playing an after-school sport where they don't play it regularly inside of a school, but they could play it inside of a after-school program, or just teach them a technical trade. There are many things that are possible for children in after-school programs. And so for us to cut a program would be detrimental to our students.
I would prefer that we decide how much money we want to subsidize each child in this country. I would give bigger subsidies to low-income kids. Let them choose schools, and if they want after-school programs, let them choose schools with after-school programs. If they want schools with different after-school programs, let them choose that. If they don't want after-school programs and they want the money spent elsewhere, let them decide what's best for their children.
Are you actually talking about the children making those choices?
No, the families.
All right.
Very briefly. Thank you. The gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Scafidi, I'm trying to tease out the proper relationship between the state and the federal government here. I mean, I represent South Dakota, and in my state, as I suspect there are in many states, there's a constitutional obligation for them to adequately fund education. Of course, I am glad that is in our state's constitution. It's critically important. So state policymakers, understanding that constitutional obligation, have established a special capital outlay tax levy so that South Dakota can avoid some of the tragic nightmares that the chairman opened today's discussion with highlighting. State policymakers also recently instituted a substantial tax increase, statewide tax increase, to allow for a significant increase in teacher salaries, and the money was targeted to that effect. And I don't think anybody would say that the job is done, but I think most South Dakotans would acknowledge that there has been good attempts by policymakers to meet their constitutional obligations. So as we talk about the creation of an additional, $100 billion grant program to help out those who have not taken those prudent steps, I'm concerned that we are rewarding bad behavior. Is my concern misplaced?
Yeah, it's similar to the question that Representative from Virginia asked. Money's fungible. If the federal government gives states and school districts money, they can use money that they were dedicating for that purpose and move it somewhere else. And so, yes, I mean, you are allowing states to do that and school districts to do that if you increase federal funding for schools for any purpose.
Well, and maybe even more of a concern long-term, doesn't that send the message to states that if they lag in educational investment, if they don't make the uncomfortable decisions to properly invest in education, then, perhaps the federal government will step up and maybe paper over their deficiencies?
Yes.
So it seems to me that quite a number of people believe that our federal government is not properly funding Title I. It seems to me that there are quite a number of people who feel like our federal government is not properly investing in IDEA. And lots of people, certainly in my state, think those things and also think that we're not properly investing in impact aid, making good on our commitments that the federal government's promised. I look at this and I think, well, this seems like a very Washington, D.C. thing to do. Rather than coming together to try to figure out how we properly invest in our existing programs and in our existing obligations, we are instead going to create another program so that we can, once again, overpromise and underdeliver. Am I just being too cynical?
No, it's just math. If you spend money here on any purpose, you can't spend that same money here. And that's true for any organization, any walk of life, government, nonprofit, for-profit. That's just math.
Well, and maybe I might close, Mr. Chairman, by just noting that in any given day, this town doesn't work very well. And if we continue to concentrate more and more of our educational leadership and our educational investment in this town, I have grave concerns that the American people and the American school children will be disappointed in our efforts and our investment. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for taking the time. I know it's been a couple of hours, and we really appreciate your patience and your ability to help us have a critical conversation about investment. As my colleague from Connecticut said, this is an investment. This is an investment in our children, which is an investment in the future. I know that there's a clear correlation between graduating kids to getting higher income, which is future opportunity to tax, which again, right, becomes a future investment in the well-being of all of us. Dr. Contreras, thank you so much for sharing your story today. I have a set of questions for you that I would like a yes or no answer to. We're going to try to do this real quick. Have you heard of kids sitting in classrooms that are invested with mold or dripping with humidity?
I'm sorry. Because of the age of the facilities and of the HVAC systems, because of the schools across the country are under-maintained, I think it is reasonable to say there is mold in classrooms across this country, significant cases.
That's a yes?
Yes.
Yes. So kids sitting in classrooms where there's mold, yes. Has there been an instance where the circuits blow when the teachers plug in a computer or a space heater that you've heard of?
Where they brought in a computer?
Yeah, plugged in a computer or a space heater, and the circuits
absolutely.
Yes, all right. Do the security cameras work in your children's school?
No.
Are the sidewalks at your children's school turning into gravel and their playgrounds deteriorating?
Are the sidewalks turning into gravel?
Yeah.
There are cases of that
And
across
deteriorating.
the district.
So yes?
Yes.
Thank you. While your answers are very informative, they're also extremely alarming. Elevated levels of mold spores cause children with existing respiratory conditions such as allergies or asthma to have a higher risk for health problems. Asthma attacks are triggered by damp buildings and mold growth. So my question to you is, what are the asthma rates in North Carolina compared to the national average?
You're asking why are the asthma rates higher?
Yeah. No, what are the rates? Do you know?
What are the asthma? In my school district, we have about 5,500 cases of asthma that we know about. In the schools, 57% of those cases are in the poorest schools.
All right, thank you. In North Carolina, total is 9.2%. The national average is 9%. So we could clearly see there is a correlation. So I do appreciate you for helping us talk about that. Randy, I had question for you. I know in your testimony, you cited the findings from a recent AFT report, A Decade of Neglect Public Education Funding in the Aftermath of the Great Recession, that 25 states spend less on K through 12 education in 2016 than they did prior to the recession. Chronic underfunding explains why in 38 states the average teacher's salary is lower in 2018 than it was in 2009. Why the pupil-teacher ratio was worse in 35 states in 2016 than in 2008. I know my colleague earlier from South Dakota mentioned the constitutional obligations that exist, but I'm a little baffled about this statistic that you lay out in that report. And so I wanted to ask you that in the United States, do you think there is less value in education today than, let's say, in the previous 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years?
Let me just say, I think that parents value public education and value education as much today as they ever have. I think this is a creation of choices that virtually every state has an obligation, as South Dakota does, to its students. They say it differently, but every state basically has it. What we've seen over the course of time, particularly in the last 10 years, is that when the recession hit, there were lots of cuts, and there were many states that made different choices. And frankly, some of the states that made the choices to actually fund education are now getting hit worse because of the cutting of SALT. And so you see a terrible situation that the federal government in the tax bill is actually going to penalize the states that made more effort to fund education.
I believe in every district in this country, education is a top priority. Our children are a top priority. In every community you go into, people talk about how important teachers are. So it is time that we put our values first and invest in our teachers, invest in our students, and invest in a proper future that all Americans deserve. Thank you so much for your testimonies today. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Folger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And once again, committee, hang in there. You're getting close, all right? First of all, just an observation and then a question for Mr. Scafidi. It's not a whole lot different, but a little bit from what Mr. Klein, Mr. Johnson had to say. In terms of an observation, this has been informative for me because the perspectives on these issues is so incredibly different on the legislative panel here. And for example, the scenario that my colleague Representative Hayes described in Connecticut is pretty much diametrically opposed to what we experience in Idaho, but it's a totally different demographic. It's a totally different set of needs and circumstances, which I'll share my own bias in that sense, absolutely convinces me that there's got to be local governance over education. But here's our situation in Idaho. We put a little bit over 50% of our general fund into K-12, another 12 or 13 into higher ed. So that's about 63% of our general fund goes towards education in some fashion. Interestingly enough, with medical costs raising and expansions of Medicaid and those types of things, we have healthcare competing with education for government money. And that puts some really interesting stakeholders at each other's throat. But to further complicate things, we have nearly 2/3 of our land mass is federally owned, and we have a heavy dependence on property tax. So you take out 2/3 of the base, and things have to get real creative in order to fund your education and, for that matter, anything else. So we've had to get creative. We had to do different things. And so two things have kind of been the focus for us. Number one is we got away from the paradigm, or we're trying to get away from the paradigm that throwing money at stuff helps. Yes, of course, you've got to have resources, but there's not an automatic connection between money and performance within the school system. The second thing is we've got a tremendous amount of rural areas. School choice has been we've had to do it. And it has worked, and it's not fun in a lot of cases because it has inserted some competition, but the results have really helped. But you put up a slide right at the very beginning of your presentation. We see it. The administrative cost has gone up significantly. Mr. Klein talked about federal administrative, and there's definitely been some burdens there. If we had our choice, we wouldn't want any federal money. We'd send the whole thing to Connecticut or to New Hampshire, and I'm sure that they would be fine with that. We don't want the regulations, and a lot of us don't want the money at all. We have to do something because we don't have landmass to tax, but administrative costs is where I'm trying to go with this diatribe here. Can you provide any counsel or any guidance on, are there ways, given our circumstances where we've got to be very creative in how we fund things, have you seen examples or patterns of success in reducing administrative costs so we can focus on keeping that in the classroom and to the teachers?
I have not. 48 states plus the District of Columbia have had the staffing surge since 1992. Only Nevada and Arizona have not. Their student populations have grown dramatically, and their funding, is just keeping up. So they're kind of roughly holding serve, depending on the time period you look at. I think we need more transparency in how public education dollars are spent. We need more transparency on what the total amount spent per student is, but also historical. And finally, I think if we let educators choose how to run schools, and we let parents choose which of those schools they think is best for their children, I think they'd be choosing something very different in a lot of cases than what our kids are getting today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you for this hearing. Thanks for each member of the panel for being here. Important topic. I'm a recovering school board member. Obviously, before that, I was a dad. My oldest, who was just going into kindergarten when somebody asked me there was a vacancy on the school board, and they told me it was only 1 hour a month. And, yeah. And it was a pastor that told me that. That's when I figured out pastors lie sometimes. But I'm so glad that I did that. My wife went on for 8 years after I had served our school board. And I appreciate the conversation. I do think it comes to my assessment, having spent so much time and so passionate about education, it really is local leadership can make all the difference too, and state leadership, no doubt about it. States need to recognize that that's a priority. Our school boards get their authority delegated through the state government, but at the local level, we need school board members that, quite frankly, that hold our administrations accountable. I was honored to work with a school board member that actually was, when my wife and I went to school there, he taught problems of democracy. So if I mess up as a member of Congress, I blame it on Mr. Fisher. But he was a great superintendent. He knew that we had to constantly invest in our schools, that you couldn't wait till things imploded and then expect somebody else to bail you out or do a huge tax increase all at once. We kind of nibbled at it, and and it's a very rural school district. Geographically, it's one of the largest in Pennsylvania. Enrollment's it's not that big, though. I don't know if they have 1,200 students today. It's probably less than that. And so I want to start with Ms. King. First of all, thank you for your leadership with PTA. I really have enjoyed my relationship with the National PTA. We worked together on a number of projects, including the Family Engagement Center, where, and I was pleased that we authorized that as part of ESSA, and it actually got appropriated for $10 million. Sometimes that's the hard part, getting the checks written. and we're at 10 million. And it just models really your engagement, which I so much appreciate. And so my thoughts are, I'm just curious, with the family engagement centers, which is something I worked hard with PTA, and we put it into ESSA. You know, do we see that? And I know it's so important to engage families, but I'm also hoping that we raise up our next generation of school board members, you know, by engaging families there, that a mom or dad then will step forward, you know, and just take it that next step. Are we seeing any evidence of that yet?
Well, any parent resource center is going to have even just a tad bit of progress inside of them where they can get information to families to be engaged inside of their schools. As far as the 12 states or the 13 states that have these resources, these family engagement centers inside of their states, right now we don't have any information that could tell us if they're being successful or not. But as a parent, anything that I can receive to empower me and engage me inside of my students' schools and communities is very important. So regardless if we don't have the data to tell us right now, I can say that any and everything that they are doing is empowering and engaging parents that are receiving information.
And we hope, and I hope that motivates some parents to take that next step too.
Absolutely.
In terms of that local governance. And thank you for what you've done. Dr. Scafidi, I want to talk a little, just briefly, because I don't have much time, about Title I funding. You know, we successfully put into the Student Succeeds Act at least a requirement for a Department of Education to do a study. It's not, best of my knowledge, it hasn't been completed yet. At least the results haven't been shared. It was about the equity of distribution of those funding. That's something I've always championed in terms of the act was called the ACE Act, All Children Are Equal, because depending what zip code you lived in, there was more money per child to offset the impact of poverty. You know, is that something, in terms of Title I and the distribution, the equity of those funds, because right now most of the money goes to large suburban districts that have poverty. There's not a zip code that doesn't have poverty, but the incidence of poverty is smaller compared to you know, rural and urban districts where it can be higher. Any thoughts on the role if we actually get that Title I funding fixed so it's distributed equally?
Just two comments. Does anyone know the lowest child poverty rate in this country since 1960, when that is? Right now. Second, federal funding targeted to low-income students should go to low-income students and should go where it's needed the most. And, you know, state departments of education need to, you know, make sure that that's happening, and school districts within should work on that as well.
Well, hopefully the Department of Education will get that study done in a timely manner. It's already past that point, I think, and so that we can perhaps fix the distribution system for those Title I funds. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize myself for questions and start with Mr. Scafidi. You showed this chart. The purpose of statistics is to make a point, and we've said the apparent point of this is that we're wasting all the money on other staff that could be spent somewhere else, and what could be done with all that money. And I was surprised, initially surprised that it's about even-steven teachers and non-teachers. Then I thought about it. Teacher aides are not included as teachers, right?
Correct.
Okay, so if you had a teacher aide in each classroom, you'd be up to even-steven already. All classrooms don't have teachers, but because of Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, you'll have a lot of teacher aides. This doesn't include bus drivers.
Bus drivers are counted as all other staff.
Okay, so if you have a 30 classrooms, about how many bus drivers do you think you'd have?
30 classrooms?
Yeah.
Oh, I guess it depends on class size as well, but a bunch.
A bunch, okay. Cafeteria workers?
Yeah.
Bunch?
Yes.
Custodians?
Need them too.
Secretaries in the front office?
Well, they're more of a fixed cost, but yes.
Okay, the idea, you're getting pretty close to 50-50, and I think I understood you in response to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania saying you couldn't figure out who to cut. We haven't gotten the guidance counselors, we never have enough of those. And we haven't started talking about the superintendent's office, and you'd expect a superintendent and staff doing research and administration. What would be a reasonable ratio?
The point I was making with that chart was that is a sharp break with American public school history.
Well, you didn't say anybody would be, when I grew up, they didn't have school buses for African-American students, so there's a lot of stuff that we're doing now that we weren't doing before.
That's a great point.
But you didn't indicate anybody that could be left off. And so the conclusion that all of this money is being wasted isn't an accurate conclusion that you ought to draw from the fact that it's 50-50, isn't that right?
To your first point, that's why I start my main analysis at 1992 to allow for school integration and integration of special needs.
Okay, but you said by the time you've gotten through teacher aides and bus drivers, you're almost to 50-50 already.
Well, if you're increasing students by 20%.
I'm not talking about student, we're talking about what it is today.
Yes, what I was saying
is
is.
You haven't indicated anybody in a normal school system, just in the school, 30, you don't have a football coach. There are a lot of things that would add up a non-supervisory. Who would you cut out from the list that's there today?
I actually got this email from the CFO of a large school district in Florida when he saw one of my reports. And he said, what should I do? And I said, do what they do in other walks of life. Look at every single expenditure and every single person and say, is that the best use of those funds? And if the state government or the federal government is making you spend the money that way or hire that person, ask them to let you out of that.
But the initial reaction that most people have is a 50-50 ratio should not be shocking. Ms. Weingartner, is there anything shocking about a 50-50 ratio of school employees?
Not right now, given how much we do in terms of feeding kids and how much we do in terms of transportation, IDEA, and all the remedial kind of work, and frankly, all the testing kind of issues that have happened in schools.
Okay, and Mrs. Scafidi indicated that we're talking about math. If we're talking about school construction and you're trying to discuss salaries with the school board and they show you what they're spending on eliminating mold, on fixing leaky roofs, on air conditioning and things like that, how does that affect your ability to discuss teacher salaries?
Different school districts and different individual schools have different needs.
Ms. Weingartner.
Oh, sorry.
How does that affect your ability to discuss teacher salaries?
If what's happening is that every issue, the most important immediate issue is the one that teachers always want fixed first. So when schools are leaky, or when there's this much mold or this much respiratory illness, you're going to hear everyone, including teachers, say, fix that first. And so having a pot of money that goes for infrastructure will then enable locals and others to negotiate teacher salary and teacher conditions. That's why your bill, sir, is so important.
Thank you. Dr. Scafidi, I cut you off. I didn't mean to. Did you have a comment on that?
No, I was just saying different schools have different needs, and yes, they should address their highest priority
We're talking
needs.
arithmetic. If you're spending a lot of money on fixing the leaky roof, you don't have the money for teacher salaries. Thank you. This ends the questioning. Dr. Fox, do you have a closing comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have some brief closing comments, and I want to begin by thanking the witnesses for being here today. It has been a long hearing, and I appreciate your patience in being here, and I want to thank the chairman for his attention to the issues. This hearing has taken me back to my school board days, And even though that experience was one of the most formative in my life, a congressional hearing in Washington that sounds like a school board meeting is not necessarily a good thing. Teachers and students deserve the best working and learning environments money can buy. And if the money we're spending at every level of government isn't buying what students need, the answer isn't more money. On that, our distinguished chairman and I are just going to have to continue to disagree. But that doesn't mean our work in this area is done. Far from it. We're all very proud of the bipartisan work that went into the Every Student Succeeds Act. That law is now at a crucial stage of implementation, particularly as Mr. Thompson pointed out. So I'm committed, and I hope every member of this committee is committed, to ensuring that law is funded at the levels we have already authorized and that it is implemented in the way we intended, and that is to serve students. So we've talked about ESSA, we've talked about opportunity zones, but we've barely touched in this hearing on the historic economic growth communities are experiencing and what that means for local revenues. And I very much appreciate what Dr. Scafudi said about the lowest rate of poverty for children right now in our country. You know there's more to Main Street than small businesses. There are an awful lot of schools on Main Street, too. So again, as Dr. Scafidi has pointed out, perhaps we need to spend more time thinking about how to reform the system to better use the resources we already have. I'm certain that if we put our heads together, we could find a new idea that would actually work for students that just might enter the realm of fiscal responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and I want to thank you again for, in your opening statement, reminding everyone that Democrats have been advocating for more funding in education. We intend to continue that, and I appreciate you reminding everybody. As we've heard today, this is not a moment for incremental change or small increases. Title I is at a third of its authorized amount. IDEA has never gotten anywhere close to the authorized amount. Conversations around local government ignore the reality that low-income communities are receiving nowhere near the funding they actually need, and the federal government has provided some in closing that gap. And we mentioned Every Student Succeeds Act. One of the things we put in there is that the additional funding should supplement, not supplant, what the school systems are doing. But the federal role in education has traditionally been to kind of plug the gaps of areas where, in the normal course of things, don't happen. And that's why the school construction is one area that we've indicated it's just not happening, and the federal role can close that gap. We did the same thing with special ed. IDEA funds things that are not being funded today. Title I, addressing low-income students, bilingual education. There are a lot of areas where we need to close the gap, and I think school construction is certainly one of them. I remind my colleagues that the record will be open for 14 days for additional comments, and witnesses may be, you may receive questions, written questions. Would ask you to answer them as soon as possible, and if members have questions, those be submitted within 7 days so that the witnesses can have adequate time to respond. If there's no further business, committee is now adjourned.